mura kaysa kay BBBM. Mas mahal pa niya si China kaysa sa Pilipinas. Bakit? Ang hirap. Ang hirap magtiwala sa ganung klaseng tao. Pero kayo na lang, kung gusto nyo iboto si Amy, di kayo bahala. Problema niya yan. Okay. O ngayon, napag-usapan natin yung isang Chinese na problema ng bansa. Ngayon, pag-usapan naman natin, ito bang isang Chinese na naging problema ng bansa at ngayon lang nabiston na problema pala siya. So, 60-40. Oo. So, kailangan meron siyang siya ay Filipino citizen or 40% lang ang kanyang ang kanyang investment dito sa negosyo. Ngayon, mga kotsero, ang kwento dito sa hearing para sila ang magmay-ari ng kumpanya. Nagpeke sila ng kanilang mga passport. Nameke sila ng kanilang mga dokumento. Bilang proof of their citizenship, kahit hindi naman sila Filipino citizen. Pansinin nyo ha, mga kotsero. Kailan lang tayo nagkaroon ng ganitong problema sa mga Chinese? O siguro baka ngayon lang lumabas. Maraming Chinese dito sa Pilipinas ang namimeke ng kanilang dokumento. Imagine, pati mayor ng Bamban most probably is a mayor because of fake documents. Kailan lang tayo nagkaroon ng sumabog ng ganitong problema? Ngayon lang. Bakit? Sino ba ang presidente na nagpapasok ng bulto-bultong tsekwa sa Pilipinas? Sabi ni Barbers, I always say that we have no problems with the Chinese nationals doing legitimate, take note legitimate, business in our country, but doing these illegal drug activities is another story. We need to establish the link between these companies and Michael Yang, the financier of Pharmaly. It is not as simple as it seems. These personalities and their interests are so intertwined and intricately woven in an elaborate multi-layered company structure that resembles a maze deliberately designed to avoid detection and ultimate liability in case the scheme is discovered. So the activities of other companies have not been unearthed yet, but the incorporators have gone into hiding and have started disposing their assets. So nagtatago na sila. There is more than meets the eye. We intend to get to the bottom of the issue in order to find out if indeed the drug bust is just the tip of the iceberg. The connection of alleged drug lord Michael Yang to these drug activities is no surprise. Remember that in the past administration, he was named by a top official of the PNP. He was then tasked to investigate illegal drug activities. It was discovered that the one on top of the drug trade was Michael Yang. Sabi ni Barbers. Pero wait, mga kotsero, huwag nating kalimutan to. Noong 2020. 2021 pala. Huwag na natin kalimutan to noong 2019. Sino nagtatanggol kay Michael Yang? Hindi ko. It has been clarified. Even the Chinese ambassador has cleared Michael Yang. Wow. Chinese ambassador talaga ang pagkaanohin nyo. Di ba? Chinese ambassador talaga ang pagkakatiwalahan niya. Siyempre po, protektahan niya yung fellow Chinese niya. Natural. Trabaho nila yun. Chinese ambassador talaga. In fact, he was telling me personally, I will never associate with one who is involved in drugs. Ah, talaga ba? Talaga ba? And you took their word for it? Abogado pa naman si Salpanelo. You're just taking their word for it na parang it's biblical truth. Wow. Wow. And then, noong 2019, ito yung sinasabi ni Barbers. Ni Kong Barbers. Tapos, nung pumutok yung issue ng Farmally, ito naman yung sinabi ni Digo. Balikan natin itong sinabi ni Digo.
President Rodrigo Duterte defends his former economic advisor who reportedly has ties to the Philippine government's biggest supplier of medical goods this pandemic.
Michael Yang.
In a Senate probe, Michael Yang was linked to Farmally Pharmaceutical Corporation. The firm bagged some 8.68 billion pesos worth of deals for pandemic response last year. But the president sees nothing wrong with the transactions.
Michael Yang has been in business here in the Philippines for 20 years. Nag-umpisa yan dito sa Davao. Akala ko ba we are inviting investors? That's why I went to China several times to ask them to help us. Investments, yung pera nila.
So, pumasok ba yung investments, Digong? Di naman ah. Diba? Sabi nga sa balita, 5% lang ng kanilang pinledge ang pumasok. Less than 5%. Actually, less than 5% ang pumasok. Todo tanggol si Digo.
Ibuhos mo na lang dito para magkaroon tayo. Ako ang nag-utos kay Joke. I want it done immediately. Sabi ko sa kanya, wag mo, it's not 1 day, 1 month, 2 months, it's 1 day, 2 days ka lang. Ako ang nagsabi sa kanya, I am sure, ito yung word ko, reviewin niyo yung tape. I am sure there is a law which would exempt you from bidding. Hindi na kailangan mag-bidding. Mamadalian to, pandemic eh. Lahat tayo nakatago sa bahay. So, ang minabuti ni Noke, nag-bidding pa rin.
Narinig nyo ha? Wait, papaulit ko. Uulitin ko ha. Sino daw ang nag-utos kay Doke?
2 days ka lang. Ako ang nagsabi sa kanya, sabi ko sa kanya, wag mo, it's not 1 day kay Joke.
Ulit.
Ibuhos mo na lang dito para magkaroon tayo. Ako ang nag-utos kay Joke. Karoon tayo. Ako ang nag-utos kay Joke. Ako ang nag-utos kay Joke. Ako ang nag-utos kay Joke.
Malinaw ha? Niyabang pa niya eh. Sabi ni Digong, ako ang nag-utos kay Duque. Sige. So dapat pala isama ka sa kaso ng ombudsman. Dapat pala isama si Digong sa kaso ng ombudsman. Siya daw nag-utos eh. Good luck nga lang. Kasi appointee ni Digong yung ombudsman ngayon. Siya daw nag-utos eh. Sumabit si Duque. Nakasilaw. 41 billion ang ninakaw. Baka dapat imbestigahan din natin yung connect ni Digong dyan sa kay Duque tsaka kay Lau. Diba? Ombudsman Samuel Martires. Kasi ang naalala ko doon sa recommendation ng ni Dick Gordon before, kasama si Digong nakakasuhan. Yun ang alam ko eh, pagkakaalam ko eh. Mga langya kayo. Ginamit nyo yung pandemic para kumita kayong lahat. Napapamura ka na lang, pero syempre pipigilan ko yung pagmumura ko kasi hindi ko naman namin wala sa ano ko yun. Ang daming namatay sa pandemic. Maraming namatay sa pandemic. Maraming nagutom nung pandemic. Pilipino. Tapos kayo nagpakasasa kayo sa 41 billion. Titigas na ako. Ano makakayot ko? Ano kaya ang connection ni Digong dito kay Duque at kay Lau? Siya daw ang nag-utos. Siya daw ang nag-utos. Siguro dapat alamin natin kung hanggang saan umaabot yung liability dito sa palyado na sa pagpalya ng pandemic pandemic program. Iba pa yung kay 51 billion sa sa ano naman yun, DPWH. Iba pa yun. 51 billion na talaga mapapamura ka na lang talaga eh. Pandemic din yun eh. 2019, 2020, 2021. Yung pinakamalaki yung 2020. Yung 51 billion i-divide nyo sa tatlo. Tapos ang pinakamalaking allotment yung 2020. Yung gitna mismo, yung pandemic mismo. Napakawalang yan. Napakawalang yan. Tapos ngayon, paparada kayo sa maisog. Yung hakbang ng maisog nyo. Magmamalinis kayong lahat. Anak kayo ng tipak ng mga... talaga kayo. Pinrotektahan niya si Duque. Pinrotektahan niya si Michael Yang. Ngayon, nung bumaba siya sa posisyon, sa pagka-presidente, na-expose ang kalokohan ni Duque. Na-expose ang kalokohan ni Michael Yang. Ngayon, napatunayan ng totoo pala yung mga inaakusa sa kanila dati. Napakawalang yan. Sana merong siguro ngayon pwede nang i-request ang SALN niya, no? Yung previous yung SALN ni Digong. Tatry ko nga, one of these days, magpa-file ako ng FOI. Tingnan natin kung sasagot. Kasi yung si Samuel Martires, meron din yung circular eh. May circular siya na pwede mo lang i-request ang SALN ng presidente, ng sitting president kung magka-file ka ng kaso sa kanya. Eh, total naman, din na siya sitting president. Baka naman, pwede nang pagbigyan. Makita na natin yung salin niya ni Digong. Hindi tayo nabudol ni Digong. Hindi tayo nabudol. Inonse niya tayo. Magkaiba yung onse. Binudol tayo, sabihin, mga kotsero, pag binudol ka, from the beginning, niloloko ka from the beginning. Pero pag inonse ka, tinraidor ka. Yun, tinraidor. Yun ang mas tamang term para kay Digong. Traidor. Traidor. Traidor eh. Traidor talaga. I mean, I cannot put any other adjective. Tama, adjective. Sa kanya, maliban sa traidor. Siguro naman, pumasok siya sa pagiging presidente with the best of intentions. Diba? Siguro naman, di niya inisip na, maging presidente ako. Hindi ka mag-drug lord. Siguro may mali na siyang intensyon nung una. Pero habang tumatagal, yung mga tinrider tayo. Binigay natin yung tiwala sa kanila, binigay natin tiwala natin sa kanya, tinrider tayo. Yun, tama yung sinabi ni Verge. Ayun, tama yung sinabi ni Verge. Binudol tayo ng digs vloggers. So, yan ang tunay na nangyari. Yun yung mga nambudol, yung mga digs vloggers. Sila yan. Binudol tayong lahat. Binudol tayong lahat. Budol. Tinraidor na tayo, binudol pa tayo. Ay, tapos, sana pag punta kayo sa website ng FOI, ibigay ko sa inyo yung link. Frida. Ako, huwag mo ng tita ko tumatawag. May website yan. Ayan Ay, naka-maintenance daw sila. Bigla, gano'n. foi.gov.ph Naka-maintenance. Anyway, puntahan nyo ng website foi.gov.ph. Wait lang, importante ito. Wait lang ha. Namimiss lang ako ng tita ko. Ano ba yun? Sabi, salubong pa sa akin. Tapos ka na ba mag-live? Hindi pa. Anyway. Ayun na nga. Kapag meron kayong panahon, pag meron kayong oras, punta kayo sa foi.gov.ph. foi.gov.ph. Sabay-sabay tayo mag-request ng salin ni Digong. Nung elected pa siya. From 2016 hanggang 2022. Malaman natin kung ano talaga nangyari sa kaperahan niya. Wala nakakaalam eh. Wala nakakaalam kung ano nangyari. So, ang tanong ngayon, mga kotsero, si Digong ba ay dapat kasama sa iimbestigahan sa Parmali issue? Dapat, I think. Ako, I think he should be included. Dapat alamin natin kung ano yung involvement niya dyan sa family. Dahil siya mismo umamin eh. Ako ang nag-utos kay Duque. So, ibig sabihin, siya ang puno at dulo kung bakit nangyari tong family issue na to. Inutos niya eh. Pero syempre, hindi niya inutos na piliin mo si... Well, we don't know. Hindi natin alam. Kung sinabi ba ni Digong na piliin niyo si Parmali, kaibigan ko yun si Michael Yang, etc. Hindi natin alam. Yun yung kailangan nating malaman. Kung sa utos lang ba natapos yan, yung kwentuhan na yan, o siya ang nag-orchestrate ng lahat para magkaalaman na. Kung totoo ba na anti-corruption yung Digong na yan, o siya pala ang promotor ng corruption. Okay. So, 2 oras at kalahati. Sakto. Hanggang dito na lang ako, guys. Hanggang dito na lang muna tayo for today's video. Kailangan ko mag-aral dahil final exams ko na bukas, guys. Final exam. This is finals week. Itong linggo na ito. Kaya medyo, babaran sa libro. Good luck sa akin. Please pray for me. Pagpanalangin niyo po ang aking pagpasa. Ayan. So, shoutout tayo mga kochero. Ma'am Rosemary Munoz, Ma'am Halel Custodio, and Ma'am Janini. Salamat po sa inyong mga super chat. Okay, at ayun, Samway Vlog, Merwin Legaspi, Verge, Ronald Osorio, lumampas na. Bilis. Emma Inada, LP Vlogs, Eileen, Ken Kulitz, LV Cast, Max Barug View, Ronald Osorio, Kenneth Reyes, Luigi Agustin, Berto, Nilda Galvez, Rex Urniciola, Jojo Villanueva, Honey B, 1514, Eileen Corb, Ronnie Mascarenas, Mishi Cruz, Pinoys, Rosemary Munoz, Lynn Mariano, Melanio Tadeo, Rico Blanco, Feli Mi, RJ Domingo, Everlaita Rowena, Jen, Pusang Inami, Marco Polo, Noel Lacambra, Jean Mirafuentes, okay, Justina Detail, RJ Domingo, Annalyn Ekis, Feli Saludes, Maricruz Shirane, Victima 147, Tabs, Sparrow, okay, nabasa ko nito. Albert Limacosa, Soft Bites Unlimited, Justina Dita, Lerma SJ, Dorothy Parker, Cheryl Santa Maria, Job Bemay, and one last, Albert Limacosa. Ayan. So mga kotsera, maraming po salamat sa inyong patuloy na pagsuporta sa ating channel. Huwag niyo pong kalimutan mag-like, mag-share at mag-subscribe sa ating Coach Jared YouTube channel. I-follow tayo sa ating Facebook page. And I'll see all of you in our next Coach Jared Live. Right? Bye everyone. See you next time. Bye.
It's no secret that China is relentless in its quest for global domination, and today we're going to talk about why this mission isn't exactly taking off as planned. The global arms trade makes up a significant portion of China's trading, as decades of economic growth and military modernization have allowed China to emerge as a key player in this market. In the 2020s, the country even managed to snag a spot within the coveted top 5 largest arms exporters in the world. Yet there's one market where China's ambitions have hit a wall: the market for modern fighter jets. Simply put, no one's buying modern Chinese fighter jets. Well, at least no one of importance on the global stage. Worst of all, it's not due to the lack of trying. In fact, the Chinese aircraft industry has blossomed in the last few decades. It took the country only 30 years to go from the outdated and often unreliable MiG-21 variants to highly advanced and capable modern jets such as the J-20 and J-10. So the supply is there, but what about the demand? Why is it lacking? That's precisely what this video will tackle. But first, you need to understand why demand for Chinese modern fighter jets is so low. This will help you grasp the magnitude of the issue from the get-go and visualize the uphill battle China faces in the global fighter jet market. After all, the numbers don't lie. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, China exported $7.2 billion of military aircraft between 2000 and 2020. Now, this figure might seem huge on its own, but not when you hear the numbers the top two countries posted in the same period. The number 2 aircraft exporter in the world, Russia, sold $61.5 billion worth of military aircraft during the same period. That's almost 9 times more than China, and we haven't even gotten to the number 1 spot. In the number 1 spot, unsurprisingly, is the US, with nearly $100 billion in aircraft exports from 2000 to 2020. Let's not sugarcoat it, that's a chasm between the two countries, not a gap. Even France sold twice as many military aircraft as China, despite trailing behind in other areas of military technology. So what gives? Why is China, a nation so accustomed to leading the pack, scoring such abysmal numbers in the global fighter jet market? It's simple really. 3 factors influence the sale of fighter aircraft: the quality, the price tag, and the political influence. China fails to match up in all 3 arenas. Let's break down each factor. First up, the quality and the capabilities of the Chinese fighter jets. Now, you'll see some experts claiming that China's lackluster fighter aircraft sales record has nothing to do with the jets themselves. After all, China has made major strides in developing advanced fighter aircraft, which have impressive capabilities on paper. However, on paper is the key phrase there. Chinese fighter jets might rival their Western counterparts in theory, but they certainly don't have the practice to prove it. To put it plainly, no one really knows how well most Chinese fighter jets will perform in action. After all, these jets are flown by a single air force, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, and have yet to train abroad, let alone participate in actual combat. With this in mind, it isn't surprising that many potential buyers remain concerned about the reliability, maintenance, and overall performance of Chinese fighter jets in real-world combat situations. And let's face it, this isn't really a trial and error kind of industry. Buyers want certainty, not speculation, when investing in such critical assets. So when these buyers do decide to spend their money, they often prefer to stick with established and proven options from countries with a long history of successful military aircraft development and, more importantly, deployment. The US, Russia, and some European nations like France and the UK have a proven track record of combat effectiveness, which makes them a more logical choice, hands down. In some cases, this track record is even spotless, like with the most feared US fighter jet, McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle. This makes it nearly impossible for China to compete, especially when it comes to high-stakes contracts for advanced fighter jets. Now, you might think that the relatively low price of Chinese fighter jets should be enough to put the country back in the game, but this isn't the case. Sure, China has offered many affordable jets in the past, some of which can be described as dirt cheap compared to the competition. However, another common factor binds all these aircraft together. They contain Russian engines. To understand why this is an issue for China's competitiveness in the fighter aircraft market, we must take you on a quick journey through China's recent history in aircraft development. Our starting point, the Cold War era. During this period, China didn't have the greatest relationship with the Soviet Union, or the USSR, which had previously helped the country jumpstart its own aircraft production. So China was on its own for the first time. Now, ideally, this split with the USSR should have pushed China to develop an entirely independent aircraft industry with indigenous fighter jets, but the reality was quite different. China's early attempts at developing indigenous aircraft boiled down to copying Soviet designs and technologies. To make matters worse, this trend continued well into the 1990s. So the Chinese Shenyang J-5 jet was actually just a licensed MiG-17, a widely used Soviet-designed fighter jet. The next model, the Shenyang J6, was basically a MiG-19 built in China. The Chengdu J7, just a MiG-21 repackaged. You get the picture. But what does this have to do with sales of these fighter jets? Well, it's simple. Any jet that contains a Russian engine also requires Russian permission to be sold. This doesn't mean China didn't sell any of these fighter jets. In fact, the J-7 was a fairly popular aircraft sold to a number of countries such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, Namibia, Tanzania, Nigeria, and Sri Lanka, but that's only because Russia didn't see it as a competitor to its own fighter aircraft. The first time this occurred, with the Chengdu J-10 Vigorous Dragon, Russia refused to allow exports to just any country. Russia's guiding principle was pretty simple. If the country in question could buy its own fighter jets, the Chinese copies were out of the question. The same principle applied to the JF-17 Thunder jets. Though these jets were designed with an advanced version of the Russian engine, the country still provided a vital component to the plane. This also meant Russia had a say in who could buy the jet. So the engine in most early Chinese fighter aircraft is what significantly hindered their sales on a global scale. But if these engines represent such a bottleneck, a logical question arises: why doesn't China just manufacture its own engines? Well, it does actually. The modern Russian turbofan jets and copied turbojet engines were followed by modern Chinese engines in the country's production. However, developing and producing reliable, high-performance jet engines is an incredibly complex and challenging task that requires advanced technology, expertise, and years of research and development. Years that China spent copying Soviet aircraft designs. So now that the nation was on its own, the engines it produced were expectedly more expensive than their Russian counterparts. The JF-17 sales have especially been hampered by the lack of an affordable Chinese engine for the aircraft. Of course, this makes perfect sense. Why would buyers choose a more expensive, unproven Chinese engine when they can opt for a cheaper, more reliable Russian one? This is particularly true for countries that have a long-standing relationship with Russia and trust its technology. However, the same applies even to past Chinese buyers. Just look at it this way: they primarily turn to China for fighter jets because of the low cost. So why would they pay more for the same aircraft all of a sudden? Plus, let's not forget that many of these countries are all set with the aircraft they got from China a decade or so ago. The last thing they need is a more expensive replacement for their existing aircraft. That's why it shouldn't be surprising that the list of buyers of the Chinese fighter jets has remained pretty much unchanged for decades. According to a Center for Strategic and International Studies report, the bulk of China's weapons sales has gone to Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, with roughly 63%. The aircraft sales are no different. That makes two of the crucial fighter aircraft selling points in which China lags: proven quality and affordable price tag. But what about the third, political influence? The third factor is arguably the biggest in China's abysmal fighter jet sales and the limited number of past, present, and potential future buyers. You see, all the snazziest tech means nothing if you have no friends to sell it to. That's right, the international fighter aircraft market isn't all about quality and cost. It's primarily about decades-long partnerships and political ties. Spoiler alert, China isn't winning in this arena either, and that's putting it mildly. In fact, the country is substantially more successful in making enemies than friends in this area, and all others. Take the Philippines as an example. During his presidency, which started in 2016, Rodrigo Duterte had one primary goal: to steer the Philippines away from the US and toward China. This goal also included replacing the old hand-me-down fighter jets purchased from the US with Chinese aircraft. Now, on paper, this partnership looked like a slam dunk for China. After all, the Philippines lacked funds, remained unaligned, and was eager to pursue a pro-China course. Yet no such partnership has been established, and China's misguided foreign policy is to blame. Instead of dealing a significant blow to the US's influence in the region and selling a few squadrons of fighter jets to the Philippines, China eventually provoked the Philippines by sending naval vessels into its territory without authorization. Worst of all, this was just the beginning of the many maritime run-ins between the countries. As of 2024, it's safe to say that the Philippines won't be looking to China for any kind of military equipment anytime soon. But the Philippines isn't the only country with such a sentiment. In fact, it isn't the only Chinese neighbor that's been wary of China's intentions in the region. So has India. But it gets even worse. Not only does India, a country interested in sourcing weapons from multiple sources, refuse to purchase fighter jets from China, but it's even modernizing its equipment to counteract China's actions. So instead of an ally, China has turned India, the fourth largest military power in the world, into its adversary, all because of the contested Himalayan frontier. In 2023, India approved a purchase of military equipment worth $8.5 billion, and not a single cent went directly to China. Talk about a missed opportunity. Similar sentiments are echoed across Southeast Asia. Beijing's ambitions in the region cause Vietnam to not even consider acquiring a Chinese fighter. The same goes for Malaysia and Indonesia. And even countries on other continents like Egypt became closer to other suppliers despite being China's traditional customers in the past. This pattern highlights a monumental failure in China's foreign policy and arms sales strategy. But are China's direct actions the only ones to blame for countries backing out from acquiring Chinese fighters? The answer is no. The truth is that fighter jet sales are a popularity contest, and the word popular certainly isn't the first adjective to come to mind when describing China. So it's not uncommon for countries that have no direct conflict with China to abandon deals with the country due to international pressures. One of the most notable examples is Turkey. In 2013, Turkey struck a massive $4 billion deal with China to acquire its high-end missile defense systems. However, the deal was cancelled in 2015 as Turkey faced intense pressure from its NATO allies, particularly the US, primarily over security concerns. And this was almost a decade ago, when the West still looked at China somewhat favorably. Imagine the backlash today, given the current global sentiment toward China. Like in 2013, the US would undoubtedly spearhead this backlash. After all, the country is currently waging what many refer to as Cold War 2.0 against China. So it's simple really. If you purchase fighter jets from China, you inadvertently choose sides, or at the very least, you risk damaging your relationship with the US. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that any country even remotely affiliated with the US hasn't dared to purchase Chinese fighter jets. And that's despite a single Chinese J-10 jet reportedly costing $40 million, while its closest US contemporary, the F-16 Fighting Falcon, costs $63 million. Interestingly, the same hesitation doesn't apply to Chinese drones. In fact, China beat the US in this department, exporting these unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, to more countries. However, this primarily has to do with good timing. You see, China was one of the only 3 countries selling UAVs at the beginning of the global drone market boom, giving it a head start. What increased this head start even more was the fact that the other 2 major players in the drone market, the US and Israel, face restrictions in selling their drones to many countries due to export control regulations. China capitalized on this opportunity and aggressively marketed its drones to a wide range of countries, offering competitive prices and a variety of models to suit different needs. Today, the following countries can be found using Chinese drones: Egypt, Indonesia, Iraq, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Myanmar, Nigeria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkmenistan, United Arab Emirates, and others. These countries alone have spent over $700 million on Chinese military drones. It's no wonder that Beijing captured over 5% of the global arms market between 2014 and 18, mostly thanks to these sales. Given the amount of money at stake here, it's understandable that China is desperate to capture a more substantial piece of the global fighter aircraft market, and let us tell you, there's some serious money to be made. In 2023 alone, the global fighter jet market reached $122.12 billion. By 2028, this number is expected to rise to $170.16 million. That's a 6.5% compound annual growth rate between 2024 and 28. But does China stand a chance in this highly competitive and lucrative market? A quick overview of the country's fighter jet offerings should indicate its potential. Interestingly, China has the second largest fighter aircraft fleet in the world, with roughly 1,200 jets. The only country that has more is the US, with 1,854, yet the US is selling fighters left and right. Turkey got $23 billion worth of F-16 fighter jets. Greece got $8.6 billion worth of F-35 stealth fighter jets. Israel got $18 billion worth of F-15 fighter jets. And that's just 2024. On the other hand, there's only one model that's actually selling in China, the JF-17 Thunder or FC-1 Xiaolong. However, China isn't the only country involved in the production of this aircraft, so is Pakistan. In fact, the countries are said to have co-developed this fighter jet to meet the Pakistani needs for a cheap and light aircraft. Pakistan is believed to produce about 58% of the JF-17's airframe and subsystems, which includes the wings, tail, and forward fuselage sections. The country is also reported to perform the final assembly. On the other hand, China is in charge of the remaining 42%, mainly tackling the engine and the mid and rear fuselages. Even if we don't count Pakistan as an export sale country, the list of buyers and prospective buyers for this jet is in no way limited. In 2016, Myanmar bought 16 of these airframes for approximately $560 million. The same year, Nigeria bought 3 JF-17s for some $25 million. In 2024, Azerbaijan signed a contract to purchase an unspecified number of these jets for $1.6 billion. Though, to be fair, the success of this fighter jet probably has to do with the fact that it's marketed as a Pakistani product, thus eliminating the stigma of purchasing Chinese military technology. Other countries showing interest in the JF-17 include Argentina, Kuwait, Malaysia, Morocco, Qatar, Venezuela, Bolivia, Egypt, and Iraq. Interestingly, China is only interested in the production of this aircraft to earn money, which it does with about 40 cents on every dollar. The country itself has no use for it. Why? Because it's too light for the country's military needs. However, the same can't be said for the Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon. This fighter jet is reportedly the Chinese answer to the US Lockheed F-22 Raptor, a fighter jet known for its unique combination of stealth, speed, agility, and situational awareness. Like the F-22, the J-20 is a fifth-generation air superiority fighter. Its first flight was recorded in 2011, and it joined the People's Liberation Army Air Force (PLAAF) in 2017. China has reportedly built between 200 and 250 of these units, but only about half of them are currently in use. If you think that the remaining 115 units are up for sale, you'd be very wrong. To date, not a single J-20 has been sold by China, but this time it's by design. If you're familiar with the aircraft that reportedly inspired this Chinese fighter, the F-22, you'll know precisely why. In 1998, the US Congress enacted a law that explicitly forbids the sale of the F-22 to any foreign government. The reasoning behind this law is simple. Exporting such an advanced fighter risks exposing the technology behind it to the US's adversaries. One of these adversaries, China, took the same approach with its J-20. The thinking is also the same. As Song Zhongping, a Chinese military expert, put it, the sale of the J-20 was prohibited in order to keep its fifth-generation technology out of hostile hands. But what is the technology China is safeguarding so carefully? Let's have a look at the J-20's reported capabilities to find out. Remember, this is what China claims the J-20 can do. It's not like we have first-hand knowledge of its capabilities. In fact, no one does. This has led many experts to conclude that this fighter jet is overhyped, even going as far as to call it the mighty flawed dragon. But time will tell who's in the right. For now, let's take China at its word, though this is rarely a prudent decision. The Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon is a twin-engine air superiority fighter with precision strike capability. It has a wide area platform with a chiseled nose section, double canards, and a frameless canopy. The aircraft boasts three primary characteristics. Number 1, stealth, thanks to its unique design and stealth coating. Number 2, high situational awareness, provided by advanced sensor fusion. And number 3, versatility, supporting multi-role operations with integrated targeting pods and internal weapons bays. These features make the J-20 a formidable aircraft, so it's no wonder the PLAAF has already positioned it in all 5 theater commands: Eastern, Southern, Western, Northern, and Central. But that's not all. China is also working on making the J-20 nuclear capable. With the way the sales of China's other older models are going, the country might be forced to put the J-20 up for sale, but even if it does so, a boost of the fighter aircraft sales isn't guaranteed. But why? Well, this model is simply too expensive for China's core fighter aircraft customer group. That's not to mention that these countries, like Pakistan, haven't even shown interest in it. As for the countries that have money to buy this aircraft, they'll more likely go with a model whose entire development and performance aren't shrouded in mystery. But what about China's other fighter aircraft? Are there any that can and might be sold? The answer is yes. First up, the Shenyang FC-31 Gyrofalcon. The FC-31 was essentially developed to be sold, since the J-20 can't be. This is another fifth-generation multi-role stealth fighter with a twin engine. It was manufactured by a partner of the Aviation Industry Corporation of China, AVIC, China's state-owned aerospace and defense conglomerate, the Shenyang Aircraft Corporation. According to reports, this fighter should be able to conduct close air support, aerial bombing with up to 4 missiles, and air interdiction operations. Its average speed is over 1,350 miles per hour, while its maximum range is over 1,200 miles when fitted with external fuel tanks. The aircraft also has outstanding situational awareness and can carry out a variety of missions. One look at these characteristics is enough to conclude that the FC-31 is a highly capable fighter aircraft that should be able to compete on a global scale. But can it? For now, the only nations that have expressed interest in this jet are the usual suspects: Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. However, it seems that China has its heart set on Middle Eastern buyers. In February 2024, the country displayed the FC-31 at a Saudi defense show, pitching it as a reliable alternative to the US's F-35 jet. Of course, most of the Middle Eastern countries can only dream about owning an F-35 Lightning II, which makes China's pitch a wise, strategic decision. But whether this pitch will result in actual sales remains to be seen. For now, only Pakistan has announced definite plans to procure this stealth fighter from China. Besides the FC-31, we must also mention again the Chengdu J-10 Vigorious Dragon. Unsurprisingly, Pakistan is again front and center on the buyers list, having purchased 25 units in 2021. But this time it's not the only prospective buyer. Egypt has also expressed interest in purchasing 12 of these fighter jets, while Saudi Arabia is already in talks to do so. So what makes this fighter so sought after? Well, at least by China's standards. The Chengdu J-10 Vigorious Dragon currently forms the backbone of China's air operations. The People's Liberation Army operates just shy of 600 of these jets across its Air Force and Navy. Technologically speaking, the J-10 is on par with the US's F-16 Fighting Falcon. It's a multi-role aircraft capable of extreme maneuverability, impressive stability, and a wide array of weaponry. Its speed, range, and payload are also fully in line with the F-16 and other similar aircraft on the market, yet with a large number of second-hand F-16s flooding the market, new customers are unlikely to look their way. This only leaves us with the JF-17. We've already explained why this aircraft is the only fighter jet that seems to be selling more substantially in China, but keep in mind the sales of this jet mostly go through Pakistan. This means that even this fighter aircraft brings virtually no direct sales for China, a situation the country knows all too well. Will this ever change? In such an unpredictable geopolitical climate, you can never tell. For now, it seems that China is stuck in a rut that only seems to deepen as time goes on. But what do you think? Will China be able to sell its fighter jets abroad anytime soon? If not, what do you believe is the prevailing reason? Is it the China's Navy is catching up to the US, but while China's naval capability has come a long way from the Third Taiwan crisis, its apparent strength is not all it seems. Here's why. Here are two of the most powerful countries in the world. Both China, the fourth largest country in terms of area, spanning approximately 3.7 million square miles, and the United States, which is the third largest country by land area, covering about 3.8 million square miles, are major economic powers with substantial global significance. China has the world's second largest economy with a GDP of approximately $18.1 trillion in 2022. The United States, however, has the largest economy globally, with a GDP of about $25.46 trillion in 2022. Okay, so the US has got China whipped when it comes to land area size and economic success. But what about military power? Well, here's where it gets scary. China aims to position itself as a significant global military power and has set its sights on achieving global dominance by 2049. Right now, China's Air Force ranks second globally, just behind the United States, which possesses the most formidable Air Force strength. According to reports, the United States operates approximately 10,000 more air platforms compared to China. In terms of total aircraft strength, China is listed as having 3,260 aircraft in service, while the United States boasts an impressive fleet of 13,233 aircraft. This substantial difference emphasizes the United States' superior air power and its larger operational aircraft count. But what about sea power? One of the markers of a superpower is the ability to project maritime power over long distances. States which have been able to do so have enormous influence in regional or world affairs and can exert huge leverage over their less capable rivals. It is therefore not surprising that as China's wealth has grown, it has invested heavily in its ambitions to create a blue water navy that it hopes will one day challenge the US Navy for supremacy, at least within the waters of its immediate neighborhood. But how close is China to that goal? What is the state of US-China strategic competition at sea, and how is the United States planning to maintain its lead on the world's waterways? What technologies and weapons is the US Navy developing to adapt to the growing power of China's People's Liberation Army Navy, PLAN? You may have heard reports that China now has the world's largest navy. There are 355 ships in its fleet as of December 30th, 2021. The Chinese brass is keen to expand that number. It plans to increase its fleet size to 420 ships by 2025 and 460 ships by 2030. These figures do not cover the additional 85 patrol combatant ships and other small ships capable of bearing anti-ship cruise missiles. China's countless fishing boats have also acted as a de facto maritime militia, harassing vessels from other countries in international waters. China's navy has the numbers, but here's the bad news. It is increasing in the quality of its ships as well. China was seen putting its new naval muscle to use in the summer of 2022, following a visit by then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. For several days after Pelosi left, Chinese ships and aircraft demonstrated their military potential in the waters off Taiwan. This show of force would have been inconceivable 25 years earlier, in the Third Taiwan Strait crisis of 1995-96. At the time, when Taiwan was set to hold its first direct presidential election and became a fully fledged democracy, the mainland launched several missiles across the Taiwan Strait, prompting the United States to send 2 carrier battle groups to the area. China had no choice but to back down in the face of such pressure, but the Chinese leadership never forgot the incident. To them, it recalled the century of humiliation, a time in the 19th and early 20th centuries when China repeatedly found itself at the mercy of foreign powers. Since the Chinese leadership considers Taiwan a rogue province, continued American and Allied military support for the island reminds them of those times. After the crisis, China resolved to never let such a scenario happen again and took steps to increase its naval power. This was a deviation from the norm. With only a few brief exceptions, China has never historically been a sea power. It has traditionally focused its military resources on maintaining a large army capable of defending its vast land borders. Up until recently, this was the objective of the Chinese brass. However, with China's continued problems with Taiwan and its containment within the natural barrier of the First Island Chain, a string of islands off China's waters which stretch from Japan to Indonesia, the Chinese leadership decided that only by becoming a sea power would China take its rightful place as a true global superpower. With its growing economic might, especially since it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, China finally had the chance to make a play for naval prominence. Included in China's new naval assets are 3 aircraft carriers. China's naval brass plans to increase that number and bring its carrier force up to 5 by 2030, with more to come after that. The PLAN also aims to increase its submarine force by building 10 ballistic missile submarines by the same year. While China's naval capability has come a long way from the Third Taiwan crisis, its apparent strength is not all it seems. China may have more vessels in its fleets than any other country, but that is because most of the ships are still small. Aside from the number of ships, one way to measure a state's naval power is through the combined tonnage of its fleets. Tonnage is the measurement of a ship's weight. The PLAN's total combined tonnage as of 2020 is between 1.8 and 2 million tons. The US Navy, though, stands at 4.6 million tons. The reason why tonnage matters is because small, low-quality vessels do comparatively little in actual naval confrontation. The United States could build many more smaller boats if it wanted to, but instead focuses on sturdier vessels with advanced offensive and defensive weaponry and robust transit options for Marines to stage amphibious assaults. While many American policymakers have called for the United States to build more ships and restore the Navy to Cold War level fleet sizes, no one in Washington is calling for an imitation of China's fleet composition. Small patrol boats and other irregular craft do the US Navy no good in its global mission to maintain secure and free navigation on the world's oceans. China has closed the tonnage gap since the time of the Third Taiwan Strait crisis, when the United States had a total tonnage lead of over 4 million, but it still lags significantly behind. China's Navy has other problems. 2 of its much publicized aircraft carriers are older models that use a stow bar, short takeoff but arrested recovery system to launch its planes. China's 3rd aircraft carrier, the Fujian, uses a more modern catapult system comparable to those used by the US Navy's carriers, which allows it to launch its onboard planes faster. The Fujian is therefore a significant step in China's technological capability. However, how would China be able to launch its planes without pilots to fly them? China has a serious shortage of trained naval aviators, and the Fujian and its successors will add to the stress, both in the number of pilots these new carriers will demand and in teaching them how to use the catapult system. Overall, the PLAN is many decades behind the US Navy's institutional knowledge and experience. Case in point, it lacks a fighter made specifically for training carrier pilots. The current aircraft of choice is the JL-9G, a single-engine, twin-seat plane that is incapable of simulating emergency landings on a carrier's flight deck because it is too light and slow. So far, the PLAN's attempts to create an adequate training aircraft have fallen short of satisfactory. Establishing programs for cadet naval aviators has also proven difficult for the PLAN. This lack of institutional knowledge and experience makes sense, given China's history and its only recent move towards sea power. Unfortunately for the Chinese leadership, institutional knowledge doesn't come as easily as new ships do. China might have made progress at a rapid pace, but in a confrontation between carrier groups as they currently stand, the United States would still have an overwhelming advantage, for a few reasons. First, the United States has many more advanced 4th generation and 5th generation fighters to call upon. America's arsenal includes not only carrier-based planes, but land-based F-22s that would fly from Japan to lend a hand in a real battle. China's most advanced fighter, on the other hand, the J-20, cannot be launched from a carrier, and it's unclear if it can rival America's F-22 and F-35 in air-to-air combat. Meanwhile, upgraded Tomahawk cruise missiles and submarines would also pose significant threats to the burgeoning Chinese carrier force. Although we do not have good knowledge of the extent of China's electronic warfare capabilities, which could potentially counter such ship and submarine-fired missiles if they are advanced enough. Another area that the PLAN significantly lags behind the US Navy in is submarines, which was one of the reasons why Beijing made such a big protest about the AUKUS submarine sharing agreement. China currently has a fleet of 56 submarines. 6 of them are ballistic missile submarines with payloads capable of reaching the United States homeland. Another 6 are nuclear-powered attack submarines. The bulk of the fleet, 44, are diesel-electric attack submarines. This is where China's Navy is at its most pronounced disadvantage and lags the furthest behind. Experts believe that China's current main submarine, the Shang class, is only on par with 1970s Soviet-era designs, and China has not invested as much in anti-submarine warfare as in other parts of its naval buildup. It has tried to close the gap recently, equipping its newer surface ships with more sophisticated sonars. China has also introduced its new U-8 missile launch torpedo and KQ-200 maritime patrol aircraft. Even so, these are comparative baby steps in actually defeating the formidable American submarine force. China may also be able to deploy more submarines in its immediate waters, but it is still at a severe disadvantage in submarine-to-submarine warfare. A comparison of the engineering of the two navies' underwater vessels will paint a clearer picture of why the US Navy still has a decisive advantage in undersea warfare. The United States uses nuclear-powered submarines, which are faster, capable of diving deeper, and have a longer range than the submarines China uses. China's diesel-electric-based submarines have one advantage. When running on electric power, they are quieter than nuclear submarines. However, these vessels cannot run on electric power for long. They have to either surface or pop up a snorkel to recharge their electric batteries and run on diesel power for the duration of that operation. At that point, they are significantly noisier than nuclear subs and far more vulnerable to attack. Meanwhile, nuclear submarines can stay quiet and deep for months on end. Although the range and duration of operations would not necessarily be as important for the Chinese in a confrontation with the US Navy because hostile encounters would take place near Chinese waters, the depth, stealth ability, and operating times of the American and Allied nuclear submarines would help to defeat China's strategy of overwhelming enemy naval forces with a rain of anti-access, area-denial ballistic missiles. These projectiles currently pose a severe threat to American carrier groups and surface ships operating too close to China's waters. Submarines, on the other hand, are much harder to detect, and the US Navy's advantage in underwater operations allows the United States to threaten the Chinese mainland. As with aircraft carriers, China intends to build new next-generation submarines. By 2030, it could have between 30 and 40 nuclear-powered submarines. Whether it will have the institutional know-how to recruit and train competent submariners may be a more difficult matter to determine. China's current underwater deficiencies notwithstanding, it is still eager to flex its submarine muscle, and has begun keeping at least one of its nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines at sea at all times, with near-continuous patrols into the hotly contested waters of the South China Sea, making things more difficult for the United States and its allies, and the waters of the region more dangerous. It is a sign of what the PLAN seeks for the future. As things stand now, though, China tacitly acknowledges its disadvantages in maritime warfare and relies mostly on a defensive strategy to mitigate the threat that the US Navy poses. At the heart of its strategy are various classes of land-based short and medium-range ballistic missiles. These missiles, based in mainland China and on its illegally built artificial islands in the South China Sea, pose a serious threat to American surface ships operating in the waters of the first island chain. Most formidable is its vast stockpile of short-range missiles, effective at distances up to 1,000 kilometers. The US Department of Defense estimates that China has between 750 and 1,500 of these, and they pose a menacing threat to Taiwan and every American base in Japan and South Korea too. China also has between 150 and 450 medium-range and 80 to 160 intermediate-range ballistic missiles respectively. These missiles can reach American ships and assets much further away from China's mainland. Some of them are capable of hitting Guam, the largest base in the region. China is currently building more ballistic missiles in an attempt to exert leverage over progressively more distant areas of the Indo-Pacific region. Additionally, although the PLAN is not currently capable of defeating the US Navy in a head-to-head confrontation, China would have the advantage of operating near its territory in any real conflict. No one on either side expects a Midway-style battle on the high ocean. This reality means that the American supply lines would be much longer and more vulnerable to Chinese ballistic missile attacks, the tyranny of distance. China would also be able to concentrate all of its naval assets in a confrontation with the United States, where in contrast, the latter has global commitments. Policymakers and war planners in Washington have long sought to concentrate resources in the Indo-Pacific region to counter China's expansionism, but bureaucratic and international resistance have often thwarted those plans, with Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine putting even more pressure on the United States to maintain military forces in Europe at high levels. Between these commitments, China's sheer number of assets, the tricky supply situation, and China's continued build-up in quality and quantity, the US Navy cannot rely on maintaining its traditional superiority forever, and the stakes are getting higher. Many experts warn that slowly but surely the United States is losing its traditional military advantage in the Indo-Pacific region, and the cost of victory in any potential confrontation with China has become much higher than even a decade ago. So what is the United States doing to keep its edge at sea in a time of growing competition? No American naval strategy in the Indo-Pacific region would come independent of the consideration of its allies, especially Japan. So what would be their contributions to the naval balance of power in the Indo-Pacific? Japan recently announced that it would spend 2% of its GDP on defense by 2027, lifting traditional post-World War II restrictions to build a military capable of offensive operations. A new aircraft carrier, the country's first since World War II, is included in those plans. Even so, decades of minimal defense spending and the loss of institutional know-how will not be overcome so easily. Some American policymakers and national security experts fear that the benefit of Japan's renewed commitment to its military will only show up well after 2027, when China's capabilities will be even higher than they are today. Other American allies in the region, like Taiwan and the Philippines, are not nearly as capable. South Korea has a strong army, but is not in a position to play a robust role in a sea confrontation with the growing strength of the PLAN. This reality means that the increasingly precarious situation will remain intact for the time being, with the overwhelming share of the Indo-Pacific's defense burden falling on the United States. One of the items on the US Navy's intermediate horizon is to arm its Zumwalt-class destroyers with hypersonic missiles by 2025. Tests of some ship-fired devices are currently scheduled for later that year. This weapon, called the Intermediate Range Conventional Prompt Strike, is a non-nuclear missile with a glide vehicle exceeding Mach 5 and a range of over 1,700 kilometers. The US Navy is also experimenting with ship-fire laser weapons that could act as a much better line of defense against China's big arsenal of ballistic missiles. The Navy received its first Helios, high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance system in the third quarter of fiscal year 2022 and has requested $35 million worth of them in its 2023 budget. The Helios system is ideal for countering anti-ship missiles and can do so cheaply, because lasers do not require stockpiles of ammunition, which can be expensive to manufacture and transport. Helios instead uses power from the ship itself and does not require a separate energy magazine, making each shot extremely cheap. The US Navy hopes that such cheap laser shots will one day efficiently nullify the much more expensive missiles they will be targeting. Helios is currently designed for integration on Burke and Arleigh-class ships, but the Navy is planning to adapt it elsewhere. Unlike with hypersonic missiles, the United States currently leads China in laser technology, but China is proceeding apace with its own plans. As drones and missiles get more sophisticated, laser countermeasures will only be more important in the future. The Navy had been experimenting with railguns, electromagnetic projectile weapons, for more than a decade, but suspended the program in 2021 in favor of hypersonic missiles. Suspension does not mean permanent consignment, however, and the Navy might pick the program back up. Like lasers, railguns have the advantage of not needing to carry as big of an ammunition magazine, since their projectiles are not launched with gunpowder or fuel, but electromagnetic power that can be generated from the host ship. Drones are also set to play a big part in the future of naval operations, including drone ships and submarines, such as the experimental Orca, which will have a range of 6,500 nautical miles and be able to run alone for several months. The Navy plans for Orcas to be capable of anti-submarine warfare, with Mk-46 or Mk-48 heavy torpedoes. They are even being designed to carry anti-ship missiles. Unmanned ships and submarines would at the very least be expendable targets for China to send its heavy stockpile of ballistic missiles at, reducing the high American casualties that they would otherwise cause and permit the United States to grow bolder as the Chinese deplete their stockpiles. As we have seen in the war in Ukraine, ammunition gets depleted quickly in a modern conflict, ammunition which is often expensive to make, with its precision instruments and advanced electronics. Any cheap drone which can exhaust China's advanced munitions would be worth its weight in gold for the American naval brass. China is also keen on developing unmanned submersibles, signaling that this will be a burgeoning area of competition between the two rivals in the Indo-Pacific region. Drone carriers, unmanned ships, and unmanned submersibles are not the only aspects of science fiction that are quickly becoming a reality, however. Jetpacks are one of the more unusual ways that the US Navy is planning to maintain its maritime edge. Since their inceptions, the Navy and Marine Corps have been designed to work together. Supporting amphibious operations is one of the Navy's most important missions. One of the ways the Navy is planning to continue with this tradition is by experimenting with jetpacks. The jet suits the US Navy and its ally the Royal Navy is experimenting with can reach speeds of 85 miles per hour and altitudes of 12,000 feet. The US Navy was evidently inspired by the Iron Man movies. The Iron Man suits are powered by 5 gas turbine jet engines and weigh about 75 pounds when they have full tanks. Jet fuel, diesel, or even kerosene are all acceptable fuels. A test of a similar jet suit by the Royal Marines showed that these devices can be operated with a high degree of precision, enabling a wearer to take off from a speedboat and land on the deck of a much larger vessel. Although these prototype Iron Man suits are noisy, there will be less of a need for stealth in any real-world situation that they'd be used in. If naval combat gets to the point where one side is trying to board the enemy's ships, stealth is long gone. The Iron Man suits could also support amphibious operations, with US naval vessels launching Marines at targeted areas. Imagine hundreds of them storming towards a shore. They would be much harder to target than helicopters or landing craft. Already, paramedics in Great Britain have used the jet suit to reach difficult places, and firefighters are also interested in the suit's ability to help them access hard areas rapidly. Though the world isn't quite ready for it yet, we probably aren't too far away from a world where swarms of Marines decked out in Iron Man suits will take to the skies at low altitude. Because a naval confrontation between the US Navy and the PLAN would occur in the comparatively confined waters of the first island chain and not on the high seas, the Iron Man suit could prove an effective method of projecting force. The US Navy remains the world's premier maritime fighting force, but as China's wealth and power continues to grow, and as the PLAN continues to modernize, the United States must continue to look for ways to push the envelope, with innovations that we might find hard to believe now. China wants to break out of the first island chain and have more of a voice in the waters of the world. The United States wants to contain China within the waters close to its territory. Whoever holds the edge in the technology race will come closest to achieving their respective goal. But what do you think? In a battle between the US and Chinese Navy, who would win? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
Hour 0. Sitting in his office surrounded by his most trusted advisors, Xi Jinping feels ready. Over the past decade or more, he's spent billions upon billions modernizing China's military. His nation now has nuclear weapons, around 500 of them. and he's built one of the world's largest navies. Add to that the fact that China's military has more active members than any other nation, with 2.35 million people to call on. He's going to bring war to the United States. But to do so, he has to carefully coordinate attacks throughout the Pacific. He knows that the United States has bases in Japan and South Korea, around 190 in those two countries alone, and a powerful navy that, though smaller than his, packs a lot more firepower. A full frontal assault on the United States without taking care of those problems first would be suicide. He needs to secure the Pacific, giving China a route toward the American mainland as a priority. His attack doesn't begin with missile launches. It starts on the cyber front. For years, China has been working on cyber technology that would allow it to hack into American infrastructure and military defense systems, limiting America's response to an attack in the process. On occasion, China gets caught out. In December 2023, for instance, the United States conducted an operation to disrupt a network of small office home office or SOHO routers that China had taken control of, using the KV botnet to mask its hacking activities. That was unfortunate for Xi, but it won't stop the first stage of his attack. Xi gives the okay and dozens of cyber attacks begin. Chinese hackers work feverishly, targeting American water systems, electrical grids, and communication systems, with a special focus on any that are located near key military installations. Further attacks take place within the networks of companies that provide critical services to America's military, as well as attacks on systems and transportation methods that will be used by the United States to deliver aid to Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion. That last step is critical. To reach the United States, China has to secure a passage through the Pacific. Taiwan, which China has claimed for decades should be part of the People's Republic anyway, is chosen as the main target. By securing that island, China can break through the nations in the Pacific that are allied to the United States, including Japan and South Korea, and clear its route to the American mainland. Hour 1. The United States is scrambling. It's no stranger to Chinese hackers, but it's never faced an operation of this scale before. The country's success against Volt Typhoon, the elite group of Chinese hackers that were responsible for the KV botnet attacks mentioned earlier, revealed that China has its fingers in major networks. Rail, mass transit, maritime, water, and pipeline systems were all under threat. And though Volt Tycoon has been mostly eradicated, the sheer scale of the disruption occurring in the US reveals that it was far from the only hacker group China had in play. America is left chasing shadows, at least for a couple of hours, which is all China needs to start the next stage of its assault. Xi Jinping gives the okay for the next and boldest part of its strategy: activating the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF. The group has around 120,000 members, who combine to operate 6 known ballistic missile bases throughout China. However, the PLARF's real strength lies in the sheer number of missiles it has at its disposal. Recent estimates from the US Naval Institute place the number at somewhere around 4,000, all of which are capable of targeting ships moving at sea in addition to static land-based targets. Both capabilities will be needed by Xi. In arranging this attack, he's had to make some difficult decisions. He knew that a launch against Taiwan was inevitable, and the island nation became his first target. A missile barrage begins, with air support being provided by the recently upgraded bases at Longqian, Jiangsu, and Wuhan. All three are supporting China with fleets of Shenyang J-16 fighters, launching missiles of their own while engaging Taiwanese defenses in the air. The tougher attacks focus on the US Pacific Fleet. Numbering around 200 ships, along with 1,500 aircraft and 150,000 military personnel, that fleet is the biggest barrier that stands in the way of Xi's ambitions to invade the United States. It covers almost half of the world's surface, stretching from Antarctica to the Arctic Circle, taking in the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean in the process. Xi can't hit everything in that fleet, but his goal is to strategically weaken the fleet in the early hours of his new war, eliminating America's ability to rapidly respond to his actions. To do that, he needs a 3-pronged missile attack. First, he has to engage the naval bases the United States has set up in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. It's a risky move. Any missile strike on these nations will surely cause collateral damage, potentially bringing all 3 of them into the war in support of the US. But failure to strike now means leaving nearly 200 bases ready to launch an immediate counterattack supported by around 79,000 troops. Xi can't take that risk. Hordes of Dongfeng 26 or DF-26 missiles are launched towards America's bases in Japan and South Korea. Each missile has a range of 2,485 miles, easily ensuring they can reach their targets. They're accompanied by shorter-range missiles, such as the DF-16, for a simple reason. Xi needs his DF-26s for attacks further afield. Those very missiles are also part of the second part of China's missile barrage, attacking closer to the United States. More are sent flying toward Guam, targeting the Andersen Air Force Base in Yago, as well as Naval Base Guam in Santa Rita. Xi also unleashes the new jewel in China's missile crown to strike Hawaii. The DF-27 is a hypersonic missile that can just about reach America's east coast and is capable of evading US missile defenses. It'll be Xi's chief weapon when attacking the American mainland, at least during the early stages of the war. Finally, the third strike, attacking American ships that are currently in the Pacific. Chief among the targets will be the small fleet of cruisers America has in the water near China, including the USS Shiloh and USS Mobile Bay. All told, there are 9 of these ships, all packed with heavy armaments and strong anti-air defenses that China hopes to either eliminate or damage heavily. Secondary targets include the much larger fleet of US Navy destroyers, which pack less of a punch than the country's cruisers, but will still be enough to cause serious damage to the Chinese fleet if they're allowed to go unchecked. There are dozens to target, and Xi knows that he won't be able to take out all of them. But the more he can destroy with missiles now, the easier he'll find his invasion of Taiwan and subsequent passage to America. However, Xi's missiles won't have clear paths to their target. Though his cyber attacks have left the United States scrambling, it hasn't shut down the country's missile defense systems. America's DSP satellites, overseen by its Space Force, easily detect China's missile launches, giving President Joe Biden time to organize the country's defenses. Chief among these will be its ground-based interceptors, or GBIs, of which there are currently 44 active in the United States. Most of these systems, 40, are stationed in Alaska, though they're still capable of destroying intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, traveling at around 15,000 miles per hour. The other 4 are stationed in California, much closer to China's Hawaiian targets, and will be responsible for providing most of America's defenses against China's missile barrage. There's just one problem. What if any of the missiles contain nuclear warheads? Biden consults his advisors, who conclude that possibility is unlikely. American satellites show that the missiles are on course to hit its Pacific bases and Hawaii, suggesting a conventional strike. If Xi were going nuclear, his ICBMs would be on their way to Washington and other key strategic locations in the American mainland. Right now, the strategy is clear: evacuate troops from the anticipated strike zones and hunker down. A counterattack will come, but at present, the US has to rely on its missile defense systems. Across the Pacific, Xi watches and waits as the first of his missile barrages travel toward their targets in Japan and South Korea. Both have activated their missile defense systems to guard America's bases, with the platform they rolled out alongside the US toward the end of 2023, giving them advance notice of the missiles China has launched. Many get shot out of the sky, falling harmlessly into the Pacific, but the sheer number of Chinese missiles overwhelms the defenses. Okinawa is practically destroyed. As home to most of America's overseas military in Japan, it was the chief target of these strikes. At the Kadena Air Base, missiles rained down on F-15 Eagle fighters, E-3 Sentry planes, and KC-135 Stratotankers. The latter are especially important targets. They'll limit America's ability to refuel its aircraft in the air, restricting them to using the bases that China is so steadfastly attacking. The strike could be considered a success, killing thousands of American troops in the process. But Xi knows the bases aren't fully out of commission. He can't launch a ground-based invasion just yet, meaning the surviving crews at these bases will be able to rebuild quickly enough to continue to serve as launching points for the US Air Force. That's okay, he only needs them down for a few days. More missiles make their way toward cruisers and destroyers that the US has stationed in the Pacific. These ships are a little harder to strike, not least because they're not remaining still. Orders from American command have told all to start moving in erratic patterns, hoping to send Chinese missiles off course in the process. The tactic works in some cases, though not in others. China is successful in cutting down about half of America's cruisers, as well as several dozen destroyers. Again, a qualified success for Xi. A few minutes later, China's DF-27 and DF-26 missiles are drawing nearer to Hawaii. Dozens are shot out of the sky by California's missile defense systems, but they can't provide complete coverage. Many more break through, striking ships including the USS Frank E. Peterson and USS Hopper. Xi had hoped his strike would also take out at least some of the 13 submarines stationed in Hawaii, but no such luck. Even with his cyber attacks wreaking havoc, the commanders and crews of those submarines received orders to submerge underwater, safe from the missile barrage, until the US was ready to fight back. By the end of the first few hours of the conflict, China has expended nearly a quarter of its 4,000 missiles. It has wreaked devastation on the American bases in Asia, though at the cost of drawing Japan and South Korea into Xi's war. America's Pacific Fleet has been severely weakened, with Xi's cyber attacks also limiting the speed in which the US can respond to what he's going to do next. The strike's success wasn't total, but it was enough. Day 2. Having bought himself some time with his attack on the United States, leaving his main enemy in a temporary state of disarray, Xi can focus on his immediate target, Taiwan. China has spent the last day battering Taiwan with short-range missiles. The barrage has been successful in taking out several targets, including the smaller islands surrounding Taiwan, but it's also faced a steadfast defense from the US-made Patriot air defense system stationed on the island, as well as Taiwan's own Skybow surface-to-air ballistic missile defense systems. Still, the barrage will have to end soon, if only because Xi wants to send ground troops in to take the island. He can't risk killing his own people in friendly fire situations. After a 24-hour bombardment in which China expends hundreds of missiles, Xi assesses the damage he's caused. Crucially, his attacks on America's overseas bases, as well as America itself, will delay its navy in reaching the Taiwan Strait. And the missiles he's fired at Taiwan have severely weakened its naval defenses, while fighter planes from Longqian, Jiangsu, and Huan keep the country's air force occupied. He feels ready to start landing troops on the Taiwanese mainland, but therein he finds a problem. His landing options are limited. That's partially due to the actions of Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen. She's been preparing for an attack from China for several months, especially in the wake of Beijing growing bolder by conducting military and naval operations in the Taiwan Strait. As soon as the missiles started flying, Tsai sent orders to defensive positions on both sides of the island. To the east, Taiwan benefits from having an extensive network of cliffs. Tsai anticipates that Xi will look to blockade that side of the island with his navy, but is unlikely to launch a full invasion from the east. Still, soldiers are placed on alert, telling them to prepare to fight against ground troops that might try to climb the cliffs, which have gradients of at least 15%. If need be, those troops will receive orders to destroy the routes built through the cliffs that lead to the mainland. Her main focus lies in Taiwan's west. As the coast closest to China, it's going to be the point of ingress into the island. Tsai places all 15 major ports and harbors on that coast on high alert, with orders for their destruction in place if China's forces get near. Tsai can't afford to allow China to set up a naval presence on the island itself if it manages to invade. Then there are Taiwan's beaches. All are heavily fortified, with any Chinese troops that manage to land having to make their way through scores of barbed wire-laden defenses just to achieve any hope of reaching the roads that lead to Taipei. The waters leading to most of those beaches are less than 50 feet deep, meaning China can't land troops en masse. It must take them most of the way before ferrying them across in smaller vessels, all while being subjected to missile fire from Taiwan. Those waters are also packed with shallow mines, with the beaches also containing anti-landing spikes that will prevent China's tanks from making inroads. And if worst comes to worst, Tsai can collapse the roads leading into Taipei from the west, forcing Chinese troops to navigate challenging terrain if they ever hope to reach Taiwan's capital. Tsai is going to make this a war of attrition, and that spells bad news for Xi. Day 3. The United States is almost ready to counter the initial Chinese offensive. But before it does, Biden puts on his diplomatic hat as he prepares to exploit a key weakness in Xi's plan. One of China's biggest challenges in the war is economic. The country relies heavily on importing goods, spending $2.56 trillion in 2023 alone. Biden has spent the last 3 days organizing heavy sanctions against China, with America's network of allies finally paying off. China will not only struggle to import goods and equipment from the United States, but it'll also be cut off from its European trade partners. All agree to not sell to or buy from China, essentially creating a blockade for as long as the war lasts. That blockade extends to oil. China imports 11.8 million barrels of oil per day to keep itself running. Much of that oil comes from Russia, which is now responsible for about 19% of the oil China buys annually. However, the other 81% comes from countries like Saudi Arabia, which are allied to the United States, leveraging diplomatic pressure, as well as the concerns that other Asian nations such as Saudi Arabia have related to Chinese expansion. Biden is able to cut off most of the oil reaching China. Yes, Russia will supply Xi, though it isn't able to cover the massive shortfall that results from America's sanctions. And given Putin's war in Ukraine, he also can't risk Russia's trade with other countries for the sake of solely supporting China, especially given that he faces his own sanctions. Xi didn't expect this. Now he faces a shutdown. China has to defeat the United States in a matter of months, or else its resources will dwindle to the point where it's practically starved out of the fight that it started. Day 4. With sanctions in place and trade routes in the process of being cut off, Biden's next move is to speak to his allies in NATO. After all, China directly attacked America on its own soil by launching missiles at Hawaii. It also attacked America-owned military bases overseas, which would also constitute an attack on the US. All of this plays in Biden's favor for one reason: Article 5 of the NATO Charter. According to this article, if any NATO ally or member nation is the victim of an armed attack by another country, every other NATO member will consider this an act of violence against themselves. In short, China's attack on the United States has brought most of Europe into the fold. Biden has been cooperating with NATO members from the moment he detected China's missiles. Collectively, that makes him ready to utilize the power of 31 nations, including what's left of the United States defenses. The focal point of the counterattack is obvious: the Taiwan Strait. Xi has failed to take Taiwan with his missile barrage and now faces an extended conflict in which he's losing thousands of troops every day to his attempts to land on Taiwanese beaches. Even if he manages to break through Taiwan's defenses by simply throwing sheer numbers at the island, his troops will face an urban warfare campaign that will see them fight tooth and nail for every street they manage to claim. Xi didn't expect this. And this war of attrition all adds up to time that the US and its allies can take to prepare an attack. The strategy is to combine America's naval resources with those of its NATO allies, as well as the navies of South Korea, Japan, and Australia. The latter will also be a focal point of the counterattack, as China neglected to destroy the bases America has set up in Australia. The United States sends a fleet of ships, including most of its stock of 11 aircraft carriers, toward the Taiwan Strait. They're accompanied by one of the UK's aircraft carriers, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, loaded with Typhoon FGR-4 and F-35B Lightning jets. Similar support comes from Canada, which commits half of its 12 frigates to the American cause, as well as Japan, which sends most of its fleet of 36 destroyers. South Korea hesitates. It's happy to support the US in any way that it can, but it also has to be wary of North Korea, which could see China's attack as an opportunity for it to start a war with its southern neighbor. If South Korea commits its naval or aerial resources to America now, it leaves itself open to attack. Biden understands this, resulting in South Korea's role being to keep watch over North Korea to ensure it doesn't get involved in the conflict. And now the US has an allied fighting force that's capable of fighting against China in the sea or air. The fleet sets sail. Week 2. Xi has been bombarding Taiwan to no avail. Every attempt to land ground troops on Taiwan's beaches is met with missile strikes and fierce beach combat. Yes, he's slowly whittling away at those defenses, but for each victory he achieves, a road is destroyed or a tunnel collapsed by Taiwan, forcing his troops to divert over difficult terrain to get to Taipei. The few who managed to reach Taiwan's capital have been destroyed in urban warfare. This was supposed to be a quick victory. It had to be. Every day that China doesn't control Taiwan is another day in which American counteroffensives draw nearer. Finally, 2 weeks after his missile launches, Xi faces the prospect of American naval and aerial assets reaching the Taiwan Strait. Worse yet, they're supported by NATO and Japan, neither of which wants to see China gain more influence, be it in the Pacific or the Americas. Worse yet for China, its navy, though larger than America's, doesn't compare in terms of sheer firepower. Though Xi was successful in destroying almost 24 of America's destroyers in his missile barrage, that still leaves 68 to contend with, around 20 more than China has. And although China has more corvettes and patrol boats, neither will withstand the combined naval firepower being brought into the Taiwan Strait. Worse yet for Xi, America has an ace in the hole: its Rapid Dragon tactic. Over the past couple of years, the United States has been retrofitting some of its cargo aircraft so they're capable of dropping pallets of long-range missiles. Each pallet can be stocked up with 30 AGM-158 JASSM cruise missiles, which have a range of between 229 and 1,118 miles, depending on which version of the missile is launched. Stacked into America's MC-130J aircraft, which Xi didn't target as he didn't believe them to be a threat, these pallets start raining cruise missiles down onto the Taiwan Strait. Those missiles serve two purposes. If they hit a Chinese ship, their 990-pound WDU-42B penetrator warheads can easily destroy most targets. But even if they fail to hit, such a large barrage of missiles launched simultaneously will confuse the missile defense systems built into China's larger warships, as well as those in the 3 air bases that are the launching point for China's fighter jets. While the missile defenses are focused on a flurry of JASSM cruise missiles, more targeted strikes can take out targets. The Allied forces turn the tide in the Taiwan Strait. Month 2. Xi has lost the clear passage into Taiwan that he'd established during his initial invasion. He's still getting troops onto the mainland, though each landing is subjected to Taiwanese defenses along with assaults from the US and its allies' navies. Worse yet, he's lost air superiority. In truth, he never really had it. Taiwan's 142 F-16 fighter jets, many of which have been upgraded, may be technologically inferior to China's J-20s. The infrared search and track, or IRST, built into the J-20s means that it's far more capable of tracking and eliminating a target than the F-16. But Tsai knew this, and knew that support was coming from the US. She's used her F-16s to delay rather than defeat China, just as she's used her beach and urban warfare tactics to keep China from sending hundreds of thousands of troops into Taipei. Now, the US and NATO are in the Taiwan Strait, and they're pushing Chinese forces back to their home country. Constant missile barrages on the Longqian, Jiangsu, and Huan air bases have rendered them practically unusable, making it a struggle for China to get new fighters into the air as quickly as it had managed before. America's aircraft carriers, of which it brings 8 to the Taiwan Strait, can each hold around 75 fighters, bringing the Allied forces to a total of 600 when at full capacity. Add to that the Rapid Dragon strategy, and America and its allies are shutting down every attack China attempts. It's not long before America's Navy cuts off the passage into Taiwan. Cut off from their target, China's naval and air forces begin a retreat, leaving the few thousand Chinese troops still in Taiwan stranded. They'll be picked off by Taiwan's forces in Taipei, assuming they get there. And with the US now firmly entrenched in the Taiwan Strait, it's able to land troops on the island's beaches to attack the remnants of China's forces from the rear. It's a lethal pincer movement that soon puts paid to Xi's invasion. Still, it hasn't all been clear sailing for the US. China has managed to use its strong submarine fleet, with its 6 Shang-class nuclear submarines leading the way, to take out 2 of America's aircraft carriers. It's a difficult loss, especially given that those carriers housed about 150 fighters between them. But America's submarines are just as lethal. Though it has fewer submarines than China, around 60 to China's 78, its crews are better trained and have fewer targets to strike. Both of China's aircraft carriers, brought into the conflict due to the American assaults on its air bases, are taken out, minimizing China's impact from the air. Xi has to face a very real possibility. He's about to lose this war. Month 3. China has stubbornly refused to give in to the overwhelming force being applied to it. The country's navy lies in tatters, with only a fleet of patrol boats guarding its coast to back the few corvettes and frigates it has left. Xi has called his ships back, anticipating an invasion by the United States into the Chinese mainland. Xi has failed to take Taiwan. And in attacking the United States directly, he's only discovered that America's NATO allies take Article 5 very seriously. The same goes for other allies, including Japan and South Korea, which have aided the US both because of their military alliances with the country and because neither wants to see the spread of Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. Xi knows he's miscalculated. Now he faces a very big question. Does he launch nuclear weapons? China has around 500 nukes, as well as ICBMs, capable of reaching the continental United States. His country's CSS-4 Mod 2 Mod 3 missiles could do the job thanks to their 8,000-mile range. The DF-41 can also hit the mark, as it's capable of traveling nearly 7,500 miles. But Xi thinks better of it. Launching his nuclear weapons against the United States would mean a response in kind. And while America's Minuteman III ICBMs lack the range of his missiles, the country's submarines and aerial bombers could easily drop nukes all over China if provoked. Ultimately, China is forced to capitulate, though its military would prove a strong match for the United States alone and could even have the potential to defeat its American counterpart. It simply can't stand up to such a powerful united front. Taiwan proved stronger than Xi expected, with his failed invasion meaning plans to reach the American mainland never got off the ground. And with most of Europe, thanks to NATO, gunning for him, he can't escape the fact that he's been overwhelmed. Add to all of this the effects of the sanctions and trade blockades America created within days of him starting his war. They've slowly sapped the morale of the Chinese people, resulting in them being ready for surrender. America wins the war, but it's a win that came at a cost. It will take the US years to rebuild its war-torn navy, and along with its NATO allies, it will be heavily involved in imposing military restrictions on China for years to come. However, it's proven the impact that its cooperative approach to defense can have in a battle against one of its greatest rivals, putting any other major military power that might dare to attack the US on notice in the process. Of course, this is just one of many potential scenarios that could play out if China and the US went to war. It's also optimistic in favor of the US. But what could China do to prevent this series of events from happening? Would they happen at all, or do you think the US may struggle to receive the support it needs from NATO and its allies in Asia? Tell us what you think in the comments below. Now go and check out the US Navy's plan to defeat China in war, or click this other video instead. When you're a big shot at the World Finals of any team sport, gunning for that gold, you definitely want some top-notch players on the bench. You know, those folks who are ready to jump into the game when one of your usual players is either nursing an injury or feeling way too tired. This holds true not only in most competitive team sports, but also on the battlefield. And the two current global powers, the US and China, are very, very aware of this. So what would a potential conflict between China, the United States, and their respective allies actually look like? Which other military powers would both countries utilize to maximize their combat power? And could the recruitment of powerful allies be enough to turn the tides in a potential war? Let's find out. One of the features of a future China-US war would almost certainly be its multilateralism. There are plenty of reasons to assume neither power would go to war on its own. The US has spent 4 generations building a global network of alliances and partnerships which give it crucial regional access, basing opportunities, and deterrence capabilities. Its commitment to ensuring Taiwan could hold out in the event of an amphibious Chinese invasion have been relatively steadfast since the 1950s. As part of its Indo-Pacific strategy, the past few presidential administrations have been strengthening strategic relationships with key players in the Pacific to serve as a crucial counterweight to Chinese influence. These include ironclad treaty alliances with Australia, the Philippines, the Republic of Korea, Japan, and Thailand. Recent events show the US is expanding its network even further, acting on its intention to support a strong India as a partner in its positive regional vision. More on that later. The Chinese haven't been nearly as gung-ho about building effective military alliances as the United States, which could come back to haunt them. Earlier this year, as Australia, the UK, and the US formalized their new trilateral AUKUS partnership to help Australia develop and deploy its own fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, Xi Jinping conducted a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Xi claimed the meeting heralded a new era of Sino-Russian cooperation, yet the meeting's accompanying statement only committed the two states to vague cooperative activities like joint production of television programs. There was no formal alliance. There was no overt commitment of Chinese military assistance to Russia's flagging war in Ukraine, and that might be a red flag for the PRC. Some experts have called China's commitment issues an alliance allergy. It's certainly a head-scratcher on its surface. Alliances are notoriously powerful tools for tilting the balance of power away from hegemonic states, something China is clearly trying to do. Yet, China's posturing isn't as atypical as it seems. 4 of the world's most powerful rising powers of the past century, the United States, Japan, Germany, and the Soviet Union, each exhibited similar tendencies. Wary of entrapment, unnecessary financial burdens, and weak regional military partners, China has similarly adhered to its independent and self-reliant foreign policy since World War II. It wanted to control every aspect of its staggering economic and military transformation in the 21st century, even if it meant that its sole remaining alliance partner is the perennially failing state of North Korea. China's confidence in its own military potential and economic growth may not be enough to best the United States and its allies in the Pacific. In 2021, the United States' 6 primary East Asian allies alone managed to collectively spend $149.7 billion in defense, already half of China's $293.3 billion, and 37 times more than North Korea's paltry $4 billion. For comparison, the United States spent $732 billion, and while defense spending doesn't perfectly correlate with military preparedness, it does go a long way. Optimally, the US-led network of Indo-Pacific states would be able to handle themselves in a theoretical war against China. They're a long way from that. A war could hinge not only on numbers of warships, missiles, and aircraft, but on industrial production, cybersecurity, intelligence, geography, technology, and interoperability. In all of these capabilities, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand lag far behind the Chinese. This year has been touted as the most transformative year in US force posture in the Indo-Pacific region in a generation. The US is the great equalizer in the equation, but there is fear Beijing's robust navy, backed by air power and carrier-killer ballistic missiles, are already sufficient to inflict unacceptable losses on American military forces in a prospective war. Naturally, the next play for the US is to try and create an uncontestable advantage and deterrent, and in the calculation of top American strategists, the best way to do that is to firmly recruit India into its cooperative orbit, and that is where things get a bit stickier. You see, it's easy to make the wrong assumptions about India, especially believing it would seamlessly float into the American orbit and become a trustworthy ally and military partner. Historically, India was a leader of the unaligned movement, a coalition of nations who tried to remain aloof from the bipolar power struggle between the US and the USSR. When, in the 21st century, China ascended to the rarefied air of revisionist great power once held by the USSR, India began to realize it could not afford to remain neutral. Sharing a combustible Himalayan border with the Chinese, India today has charted a pragmatic foreign policy with the West, seeking economic benefits and possible military cooperation as a precautionary measure in the event of a major war. In theory, India has no choice but to hedge against China by aligning with the West. China outclasses its military in virtually every category, including better missile and naval technology, a larger defense budget, more advanced combat platforms, and most vitally, a lot more of them. China might not be producing the cream of the crop in terms of modern weapon systems, but thanks to its robust domestic arms manufacturing capabilities, it can create advanced weapons at a far cheaper cost than if it had to import them. It boasts among the world's best air-to-air missiles, especially the PL-15. India has tried to break even with arms projects of its own, but hasn't had the same success. Just take the creation of the Arjun main battle tank, a platform which entered development in 1985 and was still in development, let me check my calendar, 26 years later. It all seems quite simple then, right? China the angry neighbor, the US the willing partner, India caught in the middle, fielding a perfect opportunity to resolve its security dilemma by establishing a stronger relationship with Washington. In practice, India's pre-existing geopolitical relationships make its budding bromance with the US even murkier. You see, arguably India's greatest geopolitical friendship is the one it enjoys with Russia. Yes, that Russia. India's affinity with Russia dates back to the Cold War, where the two forged close economic and military ties in response to the Indian-Pakistani conflict over control of Kashmir. The Soviets backed India when tensions flared up again in that region in 1971, signing a treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation that same year. This opened up many avenues of cooperation, especially in areas of defense, oil, nuclear energy, and space exploration. India and Russia's current post-Soviet friendship continues to manifest itself in a variety of ways, including India's extensive reliance on Russian-sold arms, its decision to abstain from condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine, and their participation in BRICS, a multinational body comprised of nations with markedly different perspectives on global affairs, including China and Russia. As of 1991, arms sales from the USSR represented 70% of all Indian Army weapons, 80% of its Air Force systems, and 85% of its Navy platforms. Its first aircraft carrier, the INS Vikramaditya, was Russian-made too. Its air force operates more than 410 Soviet and Russian fighters, and its submarine, helicopter, tank, and missile arsenals are predominantly ex-Soviet stock. So yes, considering how messy it would be to curtail access to the Russian spare parts and systems needed to maintain virtually its entire military, convincing India to cut ties with Russia is a tall task for Washington, especially when many Indians today still openly consider the Russians their brothers in arms. The winds of change are blowing, however. While the task of building a viable US-Indian partnership is staggeringly complex, that isn't to say it's impossible. As Russia and China grow closer, Washington has not delayed in courting Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, offering military support packages, political legitimacy, and economic partnerships Putin can no longer promise. Russia's catastrophic military performance in Ukraine has also underpinned the visceral, mechanical, and operational failures of Russia's military systems in every domain. India had already significantly slowed its imports of Russian weapons prior to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, dipping from 64% in 2018 to 45% of its stock in 2022. India famously even backed out of its joint development of the Su-57 advanced fighter system, as it became apparent that it could not seriously compete with America's fifth-generation fighters. Make no mistake, India has its eyes set on a conflict with China and must prepare accordingly. To compete militarily with the Chinese threat, it will, according to most experts, have to first ditch Russia. It might not have as much time as it needs. India has a respectful level of combat experience, stretching back into its bloody conflicts with Pakistan in the twilight of the 20th century. Yet today, while violence continues between the Indian Army and Pakistan-backed groups along the border regions of West and Northwest India, by far the biggest flashpoint of tension remains along the 2,100-mile-long Himalayan border it shares with China. Skirmishes along what some consider the most dangerous border in the world have been erupting here for decades. Most recently, in December 2022, tensions between Chinese and Indian forces came to a head in the worst fight at what both sides call the Line of Actual Control, or LAC, since 2020. That year, a famous brawl notorious for its fighters' use of a medieval array of rocks, fists, and clubs, some even embedded with nails and wrapped in barbed wire, erupted in the Galwan Valley. As you might have expected, prohibitions on firearms in the LAC did not deter soldiers on either side. The bloody 4-hour brawl claimed the lives of 20 Indian and 4 Chinese soldiers, many of whom died from exposure to the elements, several more having fallen from cliffs into the Galwan River. The episode, and others like it, have inflamed tensions between China and India even further. Their military buildup in the region continues without any signs of stopping, with tensions threatening to spill out into an all-out war. Fortunately for both, geography renders both nations virtually immune to outside invasions. Windy mountain roads and extreme terrain would wreak havoc on critical logistical pipelines. Yet even if India lost territory to Chinese forces along the border, its national security would still be intact. Positioned strategically astride China's trade jugular, India could use naval power to threaten Chinese exports throughout the Indian Ocean and Malacca Strait, through which a vast portion of its energy and economic exports travel. India's lone aircraft carrier would feature prominently in any potential blue water operations against China. It's currently in the process of building another, and it would certainly need both if it hoped to deny China's access to these crucial sea lanes. With over 7 American aircraft carriers patrolling the Pacific at any given moment, and half a dozen more undergoing routine maintenance, naval interdiction would obviously be an area the United States would excel in any future war, assuming India opted to join forces. Taking a page out of China's own book, more recently, India has endeavored to build its own new naval base right at the mouth of the Malacca Strait on Grand Nicobar Island. The decision, which was made to secure India's own strategic waterways and confer legitimacy on its position as a regional power, caused an uproar in Beijing. Chinese policymakers likened the Grand Nicobar facility to a guillotine stretching over China's exposed and very long neck, stretching from its southern shores all the way to the Middle East. China knows its trade networks are in grave danger. As the PRC has expanded its global reach vis-à-vis programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, its military strategy has been to build a turtle-style defense shell around the East and South China Seas and Strait of Taiwan. They call this anti-access area denial, A2AD. The system interlaces overlapping fields of anti-ship, anti-air, anti-ballistic missile systems, submarines, and other naval and aerial capabilities to alter the strategic environment in the Western Pacific, limiting the ability of the United States and its military partners to intervene in regional conflicts. Were India to join the burgeoning US-led Indo-Pacific coalition of states, Washington would have an effective means of countering the Chinese A2AD threat, supporting an allied buildup on the Indian subcontinent, which would further threaten China's ability to conduct trade and military exercises beyond the First Island chain and throughout the Indian Ocean. So if war were to ever break out between the United States and China in the Indo-Pacific, India could be key in tilting the military balance of power. Russia, not so much. As China's major partner, Russia probably presents more of a liability than a boon at this point. Putin's military has demonstrated that it can barely fight.
For the millions of chicken joyers, only the crispiest, juiciest, best-tasting Jollibee Chicken Joy.
It's a modern combined arms conflict adjacent to its own territory, much less excel or even assist in a conflict with distinct air and naval dimensionality. Most telling of all is the incredible impact that an outsized amount of advanced Western material has had in shaping Ukraine's war against Russia. In 2022, the US deployed several HIMARS batteries to Ukraine to provide long-range and accurate artillery fire. The system transformed Ukraine's tactical fortunes almost overnight, killing generals and top commanders and devastating Russian command posts, logistics nodes, supply zones, and artillery batteries. Western arms and intelligence primed Ukraine's fall 2022 counteroffensive and prevented further territorial losses when Russia bloodlet itself in its savage human wave attacks on Bakhmut over the previous winter. For comparison, the US has over 400 HIMARS batteries of its own, an order of magnitude greater than those utilized by Ukraine of late. If anything, Russia has proven to the world that the operations it can most admirably conduct are digging in, throwing poorly trained, ill-equipped conscripts into the trenches, and praying their Soviet vintage minefields hold true. That is, if it has months to prepare. It's not yet clear whether this tactic will have any discernible impact in a major war involving China. But with North Korea the only other true suitor, China is scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of reputable allies. The truth of the matter is that Russia's air and naval assets are crumbling, the two things which could impact the outcome of a potential conflict against a US-Indian alliance. Russia's air force has barely registered its presence in the war against Ukraine, with Putin only committing a portion of his available assets to that fight. We now have a better idea of why. Russia is struggling to recruit and train qualified pilots. While systems maintenance have deteriorated, a leaked memo revealed that Russia has had to send many training instructors into the war zone, compounding the kink in its training pipeline when they did not come back. Russian pilots are reported to only receive somewhere in the ballpark of 70 to 120 flight hours a year. If they're lucky, their pilots receive a maximum of 200 hours of flight training before joining a combat-ready squadron. In comparison, American pilots receive even more hours than this on a training simulator before even climbing into the cockpit of a fighter jet. Their first 25 hours of true flight training come in propeller-driven aircraft. The next phase is a specialized undergraduate training program, coupling classroom instruction with 90 hours of additional flights in other propeller-driven aircraft. Then 115 hours later, they are assigned to the aircraft they'll fly in active service. Fighter and bomber pilots fly 100+ hours in a jet trainer aircraft for their next phase of training. By then, they've accumulated more hours than their Russian counterparts will by the time they've reached the battlefield. These American pilots won't be combat ready until they've completed another 20-hour intro to fighter fundamentals course. That, of course, is before they spend another year in their dedicated airframe. By the time they join their combat-ready squadron, they've got as many flight hours as a war-weary Russian combat veteran. The pilot crisis is just one dimension of the cracks in Russia's military effectiveness. It struggles to conduct the most basic of joint operations. If they allied with China, cooperations become even more difficult. Sure, the US would have to deal with the language barrier with most of its East Asian allies, yet it has a proven track record of long-term cooperation in multinational military settings, staging large-scale joint combined military exercises with a diverse array of partners across the globe to simulate harsh wartime conditions. The US too boasts decades of experience building resilient alliance systems like NATO, whose integrated command functions and daily practices promote interoperability on every level. These strengths wouldn't easily transfer over to the Indo-Pacific battle space, but any starting point is better than no starting point. As a parting example of the importance of familiarity and trust in one's partners as the bedrock of joint and combined operations, take the United States' role in Operation Desert Storm. In that conflict, the United States managed to clear Iraqi airspace of all threats, suffering only a handful of casualties and friendly fire incidents in the process. This was an impressive feat, considering the fact that the coalition was fielding over 4,000 aircraft at the time. By comparison, Russia has been trying to field a few hundred platforms in airspace half the size, landing almost as many kills on its own airframes as Ukraine has. Just last month, Russia shot down its own Su-35 jet for a second time within a matter of days. According to a sarcastic Russian military blogger, at this rate of work from our valiant air defense, we'll soon be left without aviation. Add to this recent intelligence leaks indicating that Russia has resorted to the time-tested tactic of executing conscripts who refuse to follow orders, and threatening to execute entire units if they seek to retreat from Ukrainian artillery fire. And you have a recipe for disaster, especially if they ever hope to cohere with Chinese air and ground forces. Assuming a theoretical conflict remained conventional, China would have to do the most of the heavy lifting. It didn't have to be this way. Russia has done the entire Western world a favor playing its hand in Ukraine, revealing that it can contribute little in terms of military support in its tentative military partnership with the PRC. For now, the jury is still out on India. If it had the United States and its 50 allies and partners clearing the skies and seas over the Pacific, who, by the way, spend a third of the world's entire annual defense budget, it could play a notable role offering a credible threat to Chinese trade. Indian ships could bolster American expeditionary logistical capabilities, offer medical facilities, and serve as a jumping-off point for the containment of the PRC between the Straits of Malacca and the Gulf of Oman. In the end, a US-Indian alliance is simply too powerful for a Sino-Russian alliance to overcome. This growing partnership could ensure that China's ambitions to dominate Asia and upset the liberal world order remain nothing but a pipe dream. But what are your thoughts on this? In a face-off between China and the US and their respective allies, who would win and why? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. In recent years, nuclear threats, cyber risks, psychological warfare, and a military buildup suggest a potential conflict between China and the US. A major attack could lead to a prolonged struggle, with China's military advancements complicating US operations near its mainland. What would happen if the United States was attacked by China? First, let's do a quick review of the relationship between the United States and China, in order to see what factors are at play here. Throughout this brief history, there will also be highlights of the type of warfare that China has conducted in the past, thus alluding to the weapons and power they currently have at their disposal. Although allies against Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II, these superpowers clashed soon after over political ideologies, communism, and democracy. This escalation culminated in the Korean War. Korea now separated between North and South, though traditionally East and West. The communist-backed North Korea, backed by a Chinese-Soviet alliance, squaring off against the American-backed South. These alliances are similar to the geopolitical landscape we see today. A different war than the previous world wars, the Korean War had offshoots like the Taiwan Strait crisis, a civil battle between the Communist People's Republic of China and the more capitalist Republic of China. President Truman initially took a neutral stance, commenting about the Taiwanese island of Formosa in January of 1950, the United States has no desire to obtain special rights or privileges, or to establish military bases on Formosa at this time, nor does it have any intention of utilizing its armed forces to interfere in the present situation. The United States government will not pursue a course which will lead to involvement in the civil conflict in China. However, he took a quick about-face that same June, sending the US Naval 7th Fleet in an act of prevention, stating, "Communism has now passed beyond the use of subversion to conquer independent nations and will now use armed invasion and war." This would be a continued trend by the Chinese government to stay out of the United Nations dictates and attempt to stronghold territories into their power. 20 years later, President Jimmy Carter sought to establish diplomatic relations with China, thus highlighting a continuous pendulum of peace and war between the two growing countries. From here on out, the US recognized the People's Republic of China and shifted their center of recognition from Taipei to Beijing, Carter saying, "The government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China." This comment would live on to today, bolstering the One China policy. Yet despite American support of the policy, Taiwan remains vocally separate, and certain American actions throughout can be seen in support of these claims also, thus subverting the policy. For instance, Carter's Taiwan Relations Act enabled the American people and the people on Taiwan to maintain commercial, cultural, and other relations without official government representation and without diplomatic relations, thus creating a somewhat sovereign nation economically, even if not nationally. American attempts at diplomacy continued under President Ronald Reagan, who granted Taiwan the 6 assurances, which included commitments such as refraining from involvement in issues between the two Chinas. Yet Reagan also reaffirmed acknowledgement of the One China policy, an echo of Carter's statement and an internal effort for China to unify under one flag, particularly at a time when containment of the Soviet Union seemed necessary in order to curb its growth from getting out of control. Looking ahead to the late 2000s, we witnessed China's rise as an economic superpower, becoming the world's largest holder of US debt. Soon after, it claims the title of the world's second largest economy, signaling a growing threat. Beginning in his election bid, the Trump administration took a confrontational stance, criticizing China's trade practices and accusing it of exploiting the US. In 2020, he said, "China's pattern of misconduct is well known. For decades, they have ripped off the United States like no one has ever done before. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year were lost dealing with China, especially over the years during the prior administration. China raided our factories, offshored our jobs, gutted our industries, stole our intellectual property, and violated their commitments under the World Trade Organization. To make matters worse, they are considered a developing nation, getting all sorts of benefits that others, including the United States, are not entitled to," while commenting on his garnering of a trade war in 2018, a tense expression of economic warfare, which is typically played out between trade partners, utilizing targeted tariffs on each other's imports. The US-China trade war had far-reaching economic repercussions, causing trade disruptions and exacerbating tensions between the two nations. But this was just the beginning. In 2021, the Trump administration also accused China of genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, targeting Uyghur Muslims and other minority groups. This almost occurred simultaneously with widespread protests erupting in Hong Kong. But what further ignited the tinderbox was the COVID-19 pandemic, which seemed to overshadow these issues. The novel illness spread rapidly from the Wuhan province across the globe, leading to speculations of it being an act of warfare. However, since the laboratory is operated by both Chinese and Americans, the true cause remains disputed. Still, the pandemic era brought an end to the protests. Everyone called to retreat to their homes in an effort to contain the spread. The global focus shifted towards responding to the illness. Unrest and distrust amounted within the US, exacerbated by the response to the COVID-19 pandemic as well as the jungle of information for citizens to sort through. This contributed to the civil unrest and confusion surrounding the nature of the American relationship with China. The outbreak of hostilities between Russia and Ukraine further complicated the matter, with China's support for Russia and United States' overt support of Ukraine mirroring past conflicts. Concerns also arise regarding China's military activities in the South China Sea and its significant investments in cyber capabilities, methods of unconventional warfare which will be examined further in the video. These factors raise the possibility of a potential attack on the US, and war seemed, as it often does, on the brink. This historical overview has touched upon economic and potentially biological weapons, as well as land grabs from China, but there are other crucial aspects to consider. In recent years, nuclear threats, cybersecurity risks, psychological warfare, and a buildup of conventional warfare resources point to a pre-conflict posturing. A large-scale engagement spurred on by an attack could escalate into a protracted struggle, utilizing these different facets of warfare and sources of power. China has made significant advancements in military capabilities, particularly in areas that pose challenges to the US in conducting effective military operations near its mainland. The Chinese Communist Party has often been characterized as a bully, using various tactics to expand its influence. These tactics include acquiring significant portions of America's farmland, a country heavily dependent on China for its manufactured goods. Additionally, China has employed unconventional methods, such as constructing artificial islands in the South China Sea, to disrupt shipping lanes and undermine regional stability for its own benefit. These predatory actions not only highlight China as a threat to the United States and global peace, but also demonstrate their determination and ingenuity in asserting themselves as the leading superpower. China's military modernization has increasingly challenged US defense capabilities in Asia. Although China still lags behind the United States in terms of overall military strength and operational skills, it has notably improved in the areas mentioned earlier. Furthermore, President Xi Jinping's commitment to making the People's Liberation Army a world-class military by 2035, combined with China's surpassing the United States as the world's largest navy in 2014, sends a clear signal that the competition is becoming more intense. US commanders expressed deep concerns about the relentless development of Chinese air defenses, which pose a significant threat to operational capabilities in or near Chinese airspace during a conflict. In 1996, a substantial number of China's 500-plus long-range surface-to-air missiles, SAM systems, were mere replicas of the outdated Russian SA-2 missile, limited to a range of approximately 35 kilometers. However, by 2010, China had boldly deployed around 200 launchers for their more advanced double-digit SAMs. These formidable missiles boast superior seekers and extended ranges of up to 200 kilometers. Coupled with highly capable fighter aircraft and the introduction of airborne warning and control system-equipped planes, the Chinese Integrated Air Defense System (IADS) has emerged as a formidable and unwavering obstacle. Nevertheless, US air forces have responded with unwavering determination, bolstering their penetration capabilities by incorporating cutting-edge stealth aircraft and new SEAD (suppression of enemy air defenses) aircraft. In recent years, both China and the United States have showcased hypersonic capabilities. Members of Congress have expressed their dissatisfaction with the perceived lack of progress by the Pentagon in developing and deploying new hypersonic weapons. In 2017, Russia became the first to deploy the Kinzhal, a hypersonic short-range ballistic missile, followed by the Avangard, a hypersonic boost glide vehicle, in 2019. China joined the race in 2020 with the deployment of the Dongfeng 17 DF-17 system, a road-mobile hypersonic boost glide system. What we are concerned about is falling behind in the development of new hypersonic weapon capabilities, said Senator Marsha Blackburn to Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall during a May 2022 hearing. Regarding their nuclear capabilities, the RAND Project Air Force Nuclear Scorecard assesses the stability of the bilateral nuclear relationship, focusing on crisis stability rather than one side's advantage. It evaluates both sides' ability to retaliate in the event of a first strike. When both sides possess a survivable second strike capability, the incentives for a first strike diminish, enhancing stability. Factors such as offensive weapons quantity, range, accuracy, and nuclear target details are considered. The threat of nuclear warfare is a significant concern in any conflict between two nuclear-armed powers like China and the United States. Both countries possess large arsenals of nuclear weapons, and the use of these weapons could lead to catastrophic consequences on a global scale. The potential for escalation to nuclear warfare adds a layer of complexity and danger to any conflict between these two nations. China has made significant advancements in both quantity and quality. Enhancements include road-mobile DF-31, CSS-9, and DF-31A ICBMs, as well as Type 094 Jin-class ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, carrying JL-2 SLBMs, China is also developing next-generation road-mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles, ballistic submarines, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Furthermore, the potential for biochemical warfare cannot be ignored. A report with low confidence, published by the Energy Department in 2023, supports the speculation that the COVID-19 pandemic may have resulted from a lab leak in Wuhan. This facility openly engaged in various biological testing, involving both China and the United States. Given the extensive research programs in biology and chemistry of these two nations, the use of biological or chemical weapons could have devastating consequences for military and civilian populations alike. According to the World Health Organization, biological agents like anthrax, botulinum toxin, and plague pose a significant public health challenge, capable of causing widespread fatalities in a short period. These weapons consist of microorganisms, viruses, bacteria, or fungi, or toxic substances deliberately produced and released to induce disease and death in humans, animals, or plants. These unseen threats have the ability to spread rapidly and unknowingly, increasing their impact and reach. As witnessed during the response to COVID-19, travel and contact were severely restricted to prevent further spread and loss of life, thus revealing and stoking fear of contact which may pass on these biologics. The fact that these weapons can be transported through air, water, and various climates under the radar makes them an even more terrifying means of warfare. The consequences extend beyond immediate casualties, also creating opportunities for psychological operations to exploit the psyche of survivors in the aftermath. The complex nature of biochemical warfare and its potential impact on global security and stability underscores the need for heightened vigilance and cooperation between nations. International efforts to prevent the proliferation and use of biological and chemical weapons must be reinforced, accompanied by robust mechanisms for early detection, rapid response, and effective countermeasures. Psychological operations, commonly known as propaganda, encompass a wide range of tactics that can rapidly disseminate, much like biological warfare, but with the toxin being transported in thoughts and ideas. These operations aim to influence the perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors of both enemy decision-makers and the general population. In today's digital age, where information is consumed at an unprecedented rate and our lives are heavily intertwined with technology, we have become highly susceptible to these operations. The 2020 election and claims of fraud serve as prime examples of the challenges posed by an overwhelming amount of information and exacted interference, making it difficult to discern truth from opinion and fact from fiction. We can already observe unique applications of psychological operations, such as the contrasting treatment of the popular app TikTok in China and the United States. In China, TikTok is primarily presented as an educational platform with restricted access, particularly for children. On the other hand, in America, TikTok has been associated with the youth's struggle with depression and other mental illnesses, which have seen a significant rise during the COVID-19 pandemic. These operations encompass various tactics, including propaganda, disinformation campaigns, and strategies designed to undermine the morale and cohesion of adversaries. In recent years, there have been claims linking internet trolls to China, with the intention of exacerbating civil disputes within America, although concrete evidence is lacking. However, it is important to note that these threats are not the only ones that exist, particularly in this digital age. By understanding the complexity and potential impact of psychological operations, we can better navigate the challenges posed by misinformation and manipulation in our increasingly interconnected world. China has actively developed its cyber capabilities mirroring the United States advancements. The country has invested billions of dollars in supporting these programs, underscoring its commitment to cyber warfare. In the event of an attack on the United States, cyber attacks would target critical infrastructure, military installations, and communication networks. Moreover, cyber warfare could disrupt not only essential services within the United States, but also vital systems like oil and gas pipelines, rail networks, and power grids. For instance, a cyber attack on the US power grid could result in widespread blackouts, affecting millions of homes and businesses. This would disrupt communications, potentially causing banks to go offline, hospitals to close, and air traffic to be grounded, leading to chaos and potential loss of life. Consider how much of American lives are digitized or on the grid. The fear of this potential has driven many to prepare with go bags and other end-of-the-world scenario preparations. Similarly, a cyber attack on water infrastructure could disrupt water supply and treatment systems, posing a risk to public health and safety. A recent survey conducted by Verizon revealed that only 15% of public safety organizations felt they were very prepared against cyber attacks. This highlights the urgent need for increased investment in cybersecurity measures to protect critical infrastructure and ensure the safety and well-being of the American population. To strengthen the call for readiness and emphasize the importance of recognizing potential threats, it is crucial to understand the significant risks posed by cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. As US Secretary of State Antony Blinken described in May 2022, China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. In the event of a Chinese attack, potential targets may include traditional targets such as US air bases in Asia, naval aircraft carriers, military installations in the Indo-Pacific, critical infrastructure spots, the US mainland, space assets, and US allies, but also could be direct to the people and akin to some of these unconventional methods. Sun Tzu, a renowned Chinese military strategist whose integral work, The Art of War, which almost all American military officials read at one point of their career, writes about a most beneficial type of war. In the practical art of war, the best thing of all is to take the enemy's country whole and intact. To shatter and destroy it is not so good. That means that the most beneficial means of war for an adversarial country is not for the cities and towns to be turned to ruins, but rather for a surrender to happen slowly, gradually. The mistrust that Americans have for their government and the civil fractions we have seen over the past several years reveal a different sort of susceptibility. Pair this with the strategically placed attacks both on cyber infrastructure and psychologically right to our pockets, and it's not difficult to imagine a swift takeover, one that may put us under siege without even noticing. This also begs the question, has the attack already begun? Over half of the young, up-and-coming Generation Z support the Marxist Communist Party, which earlier on in this video, we reviewed that the United States was and still is at the other end of an ideological battle, and which is at the center of the conflict between these two countries and their allies. Yet, in an effort of deterrence, leaders will take stock in the knowledge that there is mutual interest to both of these countries to maintain a civil relationship. Both China and the United States share a common interest in maintaining global stability and avoiding any military confrontation that may disrupt the delicate balance. As seen during the tariffs imposed by President Trump in 2018, an economic war, the US trade relationship is a serious lever to pull within a wartime or diplomatic situation, but one that demands either side to be respected by the other when considering the potential for attack. American companies exported $192 billion in goods and services to China in 2021, constituting 7.5% of US exports. While expanding foreign trade can disrupt US employment, trade with China also creates and supports a significant number of American jobs. Exports to China support over 1 million US jobs, and Chinese companies invested in the United States employ over 160,000 workers. While the tension may always seem to just be on the cusp of breaking into war, America can maintain positive diplomatic relations with China by setting clear objectives, which require cooperation, promote mutual benefit, and are considerate of national security. With actions like this, we can effectively deter any impending attack that may threaten our collective peace. However, if this threat is left unattended or ignored, or worse, underestimated, then we could very well experience a gross advancement of Chinese presence on American soil. Whether through an overt attack supported by boots on the ground, subtle means like psychological warfare, widespread biological weaponization, or a mixture of all, the threat does remain. So what do you think? Will China and the US eventually end up in some form of conflict? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
For all of the military advancements that China has made in recent years, it still can't compete with the US in one area: the skies. The US Air Force is a terrifying prospect for China for many reasons, not least because it knows that America leads the charge when it comes to the quality of its equipment and its pilots. And if war were to ever break out between the countries, China would find itself cowering before the might of America's craft. But why? China has a very strong military. It's the second largest military spender in the world, just behind the US, and it's ramping up its nuclear capabilities with every passing year. But when it comes to the skies, China pales in comparison, and Beijing knows it.
The reason for China's fear starts with one of the most crucial aspects of warfare: sheer numbers. The simple fact is that the US's airborne capabilities stretch far beyond anything that China can handle. According to Global Firepower, America has a little over 660,000 Air Force personnel. Of course, not all of these are pilots. The US doesn't have the ability to send a 500,000-strong death fleet of planes in China's direction, but what it does have is an extensive infrastructure of pilots and support crews that can coordinate massive offensives that would cause major problems for Beijing. That's not to say that China doesn't have an impressive number of personnel itself. The People's Liberation Army Air Force, PLAAF, has about 400,000 members. Impressive numbers, though over 260,000 fewer than the US Air Force. Of course, it's not just people who make up an Air Force. Equipment is a vital component. That's where the US really comes out on top. It has a total stock of 13,300 aircraft, 9,975 of which are combat-ready, compared to China's fleet of 3,166. In other words, the United States has about 4 times the number of aircraft that China has, meaning it would easily overwhelm the PLAAF in terms of sheer numbers. Digging deeper, it's clear that China has focused most of its Air Force spending on fighter jets, with the country having 1,199 of these types of planes available. But even that impressive number pales in comparison to the United States, which has 1,914 fighters, along with a far more versatile fleet of planes that go beyond dogfighting capabilities. For instance, the US has 962 fixed-wing transports compared to China's 288. It also has far more planes available for training, with China having less than a sixth of the 2,634 craft that the US can use to give its next generations of pilots some much-needed flight experience. No matter where you look, be it attack planes, tankers, helicopters, or special mission planes, America comes out on top every single time. Its air-based firepower is on a level that no other military can match. The US simply has more options when it comes to moving its troops around and conducting air missions against China or its territorial partners. That's not to say that the PLAAF is useless. It would be able to cause some damage to America's forces, but for every plane that Beijing could down, the US would have plenty in reserve, ready to replace it. In a war of attrition, China's stock would run low far sooner, giving the US complete dominance of the skies. Still, sheer numbers aren't the only way that a battle is won. Quality of equipment is just as important, and what better place to look than the crown jewels of each country's fighters. For China, that crown jewel, at least right now, is the Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon, a stealth fighter that entered into service in 2018, following its maiden flight in 2011. It's a 5th-generation plane that was designed specifically to compete with America's F-22 Raptor. The plane is capable of a top speed of about 1,670 miles per hour and can fly for almost 2,800 miles before it needs to refuel. It has low jet engine intakes and is barely visible on a radar cross-section, making it ideal for sneak attacks. And it comes equipped with an active electronically scanned array, AESA, that transmits targeting data directly to its firing systems. Speaking of those firing systems, the craft comes equipped with an internal cannon that can be deployed during close quarters combat. A pair of bays underneath the craft can hold several PL-10 air-to-air missiles, with another bay in its belly carrying larger PL-21 and PL-12CD missiles. In all, it's a flying death machine that can rain fire on an opponent through a combination of built-in guns and missile strikes. So it's no surprise that China is building as many as possible. Nikkei Asia even suggested that it built more J-20s in 2022 than the 187 F-22s that America manufactured, with plans in place to produce another 40 to 50 per year for the foreseeable future. Of course, not all of those craft will go straight into the PLAAF, with China having the opportunity to sell some. Still, it's an impressive fighter. And if its sole opponent in the US Air Force was the F-22 that it seems to have been built as a counterpart to, China would at least be able to claim parity with the United States. But it's not just the F-22 that China has to worry about. The F-35 is another of the US's best fighters, and the combined force of both would overwhelm the J-20. Where China is focusing most of its efforts on a single fighter, the US has 2 extremely advanced aircraft that give it more versatility. The F-22 is the closest to the J-20, with its top speed of about 1,500 miles per hour, being just a smidge below the J-20s. It has an external radar cross-section, which makes it remarkably difficult to detect, and is able to supercruise. That means it's able to maintain supersonic speeds without the need for afterburners, making it even harder to detect. The thrust vectoring system built into the aircraft also makes it one of the most agile ever made. So even if the J-20 is faster than the F-22, it may not be able to hit it. It's worth focusing on the ability to supercruise a little more for a simple reason. The J-20 can't do it. In fact, none of the fighters in China's stock can, because they're all equipped with the WS-10 Taihang, a turbofan engine that delivers high thrust but can't maintain supersonic speeds without engaging afterburners. That's a problem for stealth operations. Whenever a craft engages its afterburners, it essentially gives the game away when it comes to its location. So for a J-20 to maintain supersonic speeds, it has to let the US know where it is. But for the F-22 and F-35, supercruising can be used to maintain high speeds with a large weapons load, while the craft itself essentially appears as barely visible on most radar systems. As for the F-35, it's actually a touch slower than both the J-20 and F-22, being capable of hitting a top speed of 1,200 miles per hour. However, it has slightly more advanced avionics, the tech inside the craft, than the F-22. Both have advanced systems that include radar, sensors, and communication systems. However, the F-35 adds to that with a helmet-mounted display, which can show the pilot real-time information about both their plane and the surrounding environment. But the standout feature of this plane is its ability to take off from a very short runway before landing vertically. In other words, it's able to operate from bases that don't have large runways, such as assault ships and smaller airfields. That's a capability that neither the F-22 nor the J-20 can match. And of course, both the F-22 and F-35 have similar weapon systems, with cannons and air-to-air missiles to match the J-20. In a straight comparison,
CDO Fantastic Casino. Bawat kagat, dama ang mahigpit na yakap.
the J-20 seems to come out just about on top, but the F-22 is very close, and when combined with the more versatile F-35, America would definitely have the advantage in pure dogfighting capabilities. And when you add the ability to supercruise into the mix, America's top fighters have a clear advantage over China's in the stealth game. In short, China knows that it's chasing the US when it comes to its fighters. The J-20 is a direct response to the F-22, and even China's experiments with unmanned flights ape those already conducted by the US. Beijing is playing catch-up. And while it's closing the distance, it's far from achieving air superiority based on numbers or equipment. Speaking of air superiority, China is also terrified of America's Air Force because it takes a very different approach to the PLAAF. China tends to focus on using its planes to support its ground troops, rather than to establish a superior presence in the skies. It's a similar approach to the one that Russia has tried to use in Ukraine, with planes flying low to take out ground-based targets. But this approach has two problems. First, it makes planes vulnerable. Providing support to ground-based troops means flying low, and the lower you go, the closer you get to anti-air defense. This is a lesson that Russia has learned quickly during its invasion of Ukraine, with Ukraine's anti-air defenses already being responsible for shooting down at least 130 craft by August 2023, according to RAND. The fact that China takes a similar approach will be terrifying to Beijing, because it means that it's tactically outmatched by the US. And when you consider the fact that the US has far superior anti-air equipment to Ukraine, the situation would only become more dire for China's pilots. Second, China's ground-focused approach naturally takes its focus away from the skies. That's where America could come swooping in to dominate China's airspace thanks to 5 letters, COMAO. COMAO stands for Composite Air Operations, and the idea behind this tactic is to bring a versatile range of capabilities into a single airborne attack. Typically, that means several countries combining their forces and their craft in joint operations, where one set of planes may provide ground support, for instance, another set may circle the skies, defending against any fighters that would draw near. The ultimate goal is to create one large package of aircraft that combines their forces to essentially take over several hundred square miles of airspace. A COMAO usually has a package commander, who coordinates the routes, timings, and targets for the aircraft. And because the package is so large, some Comeos incorporate up to 100 planes and helicopters. There is built-in redundancy. If a craft or a mission fails, there are others on hand to replace it and launch a secondary assault. This is a problem for China. With its planes generally focused on the ground, the US could use Comeo tactics to dominate the skies above. Its fighters will be able to launch aerial assaults, both on China's planes and targets on the ground, while the PLAAF would lose the ability to escape danger by gaining altitude, because more American flyers would be stationed higher up to greet them. Combine all of this with the fact that Comeos usually bring together multiple countries, the US would likely involve NATO in its operations, and you get exceptionally coordinated attacks that far outstrip anything that the PLAAF can do. In short, the US would have complete air superiority. And even without support from other countries or NATO, America has such a versatile stock of aircraft that it could essentially launch Comeos on its own, with China having little recourse due to only coming close to matching the states in fighter plane numbers, with everything else falling behind. Versatility is clearly the key, and it's the lack of it that would have Beijing running scared if the US started launching complex aerial attacks combined with anti-air defenses. Still, China is at least trying to make up for its lack of aerial tactical nous with new anti-air defenses. In November 2022, the People's Liberation Army, PLA, unveiled the FK-3000 air defense missile system, along with two others, the HQ-16FE and the Red 11 systems, at Airshow China 2022. It was the FK-3000 that stole the show, as it comes equipped with a powerful air defense missile that can deflect most standard ammunition used by fighter planes. Add to that a mini-missile designed to resist cluster bombs and a special transmitter to jam radio signals, and it's a powerful anti-air force. Even better for China, much of the vehicle that holds this weaponry is remote controlled. That includes its transporter, erector, launcher and radar (TELAR) platform, which holds a turret that can be fired remotely to fend off attacks. More support comes from a pair of auxiliary vehicles, again unmanned, that can handle ground combat to defend the main vehicle. The FK-3000 is impressive, but it can't do anything against America's fighters. Instead, it's designed to ward off attack helicopters, cruise missiles, and similar large targets. No stealth detection capabilities means it has its limitations. All of those munitions and equipment could, and likely would, be deployed by the US in a Comeo attack. But the very nature of Comeos means that China's anti-air defenses would be able to do little against anything other than large targets that are somewhat close to the ground. For the many craft that are either out of range or equipped with stealth technology, the FK-3000 would essentially be useless. Again, we see Beijing doing what it's doing with fighters, playing catch-up. Of course, you could argue that the US couldn't launch an aerial attack from home soil to China. The distance is too great to fly from one country to the other, essentially protecting each one against the other's aerial forces, right? That's not the case. According to Al Jazeera, the United States maintains 750 bases around the world, with at least 220 of those bases being in Asian countries that could easily put the US into range. Japan is the frontrunner and a vital military partner to the US with 120 bases. South Korea coming in close behind with 73. Australia hosts 7 and will likely build more as its military ties to the US grow, with both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia having 10 US bases. Looking at a map of the world, you'll see why this is such a problem for China. Combined, those bases offer coverage from the east, west, and south. China is essentially surrounded by major countries that hosts US troops and could, in the event of war, become launching points for Comeos and other American aerial operations. In contrast, China only has one official remote military base located in Djibouti, meaning it's still not within range, and certainly not to the extent that America is to Beijing. Granted, China is looking to expand its overseas presence. Stars and Stripes reports that Beijing may look to build new bases in Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Cambodia in the coming years. Plus, its investments in infrastructure projects in many Asian and African countries provide it with some leverage to establish more bases in the future. But to achieve the type of coverage that the US has, China would need to establish a presence in South America and Canada, neither really being options for Beijing. China is trying to catch up once again. It's doing so covertly, especially with its loans for infrastructure projects that could place many smaller countries in its back pocket. But the US is far ahead in that game because it's established itself in several Asian countries that put it within striking distance of China. Simply put, America can launch attacks on China without Beijing being able to reciprocate, at least without a lot of effort and aircraft carriers, putting China at yet another aerial disadvantage. Still, if China had better pilot training, that would at least be something it could hold against the States. Unfortunately for Beijing, it doesn't. According to Air Education and Training Command, AETC, the US Air Force Academy pumps out over 3,400 cadets every year. Those cadets are training in the principles and techniques used to fly advanced planes and helicopters, in addition to receiving ground training, so they're at least somewhat effective if they're grounded. Some cadets also undergo officer development training, which improves their leadership and coordination skills. After completing this primary phase, the cadets are split into 3 groups, with each being an advanced training course focused on a specific type of craft. These groups include one for bombers and fighters, another for helicopter training, and yet another that teaches advanced operation of tankers and airlift planes. A fourth, and constantly growing, group is also selected to learn how to remotely fly unmanned craft. All told, a pilot cadet will get between 180 and 240 hours of flight training before they're deployed in the field, leaving them well equipped to handle almost anything thrown at them. As with everything else, the PLAF lags behind in the training department. Beijing is aware of this too, which is why it's engaging in a concerted campaign to bring more Western influence into its training program. According to Sky News, the PLA started a recruitment drive in late 2022 aimed at attracting British military personnel to help train its pilots. The outlet says that around 30 former British pilots took the payday, with salaries reputed to be around £240,000 or approximately $300,000 per year. However, some are calling the move a breach of security. That makes sense. Not only do these British pilots have more experience than many of China's flyers, but they also understand Western aircraft. Who's to say they won't divulge secrets? This is obviously distressing news for all Western countries, including the US. But it's also an indicator that China is playing catch-up in training just as much as everywhere else. It wants to know how Western powers operate. It needs to find and benefit from experience that its own trainers simply don't have. And as long as it's offering so much money in exchange for that knowledge, it will be able to attract people who can improve its training outcomes. This could be a sign that China is getting desperate. And beyond splashing the cash to attract better trainers, it's also trying to force pilots through their training faster than ever before. In a July 2022 article, Le Monde reported that China had proudly proclaimed that cadets trained in the J-10, one of its multi-role fighters, had completed their training in 3 years rather than the standard 6. That was big news for Beijing. It had only started training pilots using the J-10s in 2010, with such a fast pilot turnaround being put down to an increased ability to conduct tactical training and live for operations. But is that really the case? Or is Beijing making the same mistake that Moscow makes by failing to ensure that its cadets have enough flight hours to be effective once they're engaged in active warfare? What China claims as a victory in training efficiency could simply be a rush job that says something very different. We're scared of the US, and we need more pilots now. Beyond that, secrecy surrounds China's Air Force training, as it does with so much of the PLA's operations, with propaganda and the occasional news report being the main sources of what they actually do. Regardless, Beijing recognizes the superiority of Western training. If it didn't, it wouldn't be spending around $9 million per year on former British pilots. But even if the Brits can teach China a thing or two, there's one more reason for Beijing to cower in the face of America's aerial might: nuclear weapons. The US and China are both capable of launching nukes, with China's growing arsenal being an obvious cause for concern for all Western nations. However, the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, CAC, points out that it has extremely limited options when it comes to dropping nukes from the air. At best, it may be able to equip a plane with a nuke and hope to achieve a clean drop, but it's more likely that the plane would be shot out of the sky long before it delivered its payload. Beijing is trying to do something about this. The CAC reports that its development of the Zhan H-20 stealth bomber is likely to give it better nuclear capabilities from the skies, especially as its design is purposefully similar to the America's B-2 bomber. but that plane likely won't enter service until 2025 at the earliest, leaving China with no aerial nuclear threat until then. The US has that threat in abundance. Atomic Archive points out that the States has 2 bombers capable of launching nukes, the previously mentioned B-2A Spirit and the B-52H Stratofortress. What's more, it has 850 warheads, though not all being in commission, that it could launch from these planes. That stockpile is larger than the 350 total nukes that China is believed to have, which is already scary for Beijing. The fact that these bombs can be launched from the skies, likely out of the reach of any of China's anti-air defenses, is terrifying. Again, China is playing catch-up by trying to develop a bomber with similar capabilities. But until it has that and can manufacture at pace, the US will always hold the ultimate trump card if it somehow manages to lose in all other aspects on the aerial front. But based on what we've shared here, that isn't likely to happen. The US has more, better trained pilots and far more aircraft than the PLAAF. It has superior tactics because it knows how to use its versatile fleet to conduct coordinated attacks designed to achieve air supremacy rather than simply support ground troops. Plus, thanks to the US having bases established in so many countries that surround China, it's far more capable of launching attacks over Chinese airspace than Beijing is over America's territory. And even if all of that superiority fails to deliver an aerial victory for the US, it can always press the big red button and launch nukes from the sky to devastate China. It's no wonder that China is running scared. The only worry for the US Air Force is that China is trying to run toward it rather than away. With all of its investment into military modernization, coupled with Beijing's willingness to spend big to attract pilots, we may see China becoming a stronger aerial force in years to come. But what do you think? Is China right to be terrified of America's aerial capabilities? Or does it have some way to mitigate them that we haven't explored here? As always, tell us what you think in the comments section. Thank you for watching the video, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts. India has lured China into a trap. For years, the 2 powerhouse nations have been involved in a cat-and-mouse battle to gain ascendancy over the much-coveted Indian Ocean region. Only now, through canny political maneuvering and the signing of many trade and military treaties, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has outwitted his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping, all of which has put India in pole position to control one of the most sought-after areas in the world. Make no mistake though, this isn't something Beijing will take lying down, and it's something the rest of the world will ignore at its peril. At this point in the video, you would be forgiven for feeling slightly confused. Aren't China and India partners in one of the biggest intergovernmental associations in the world, BRICS? The answer is, of course, yes. So why have India and China become embroiled in what many see as dangerous Cold War-style posturing and rhetoric, not to mention a huge buildup of military and strategic strength? In a geopolitical context, the answer to that question is as murky as it is complex, but the ultimate goal is simple enough to explain: the aforementioned riches associated with the Indian Ocean and everything that goes with it. The importance of this region and who ultimately controls it is nothing new, however. Way back in 1897, Alfred Thayer, an admiral in the US Navy, made this bold prediction: whoever controls the Indian Ocean will dominate Asia. The destiny of the world will be decided on its waters. From as early as the 3rd century BCE, the Indian Ocean trade routes have connected Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa. At present, more than 2/3 of the world's oil is transported through the region's waters. But it's not just oil exports that rely on the crucial trade route, but coal exports too. 3 nations with developing economies, Australia, Indonesia, and South Africa, now account for more than half of global coal exports, shipping much of it across the Indian Ocean to India, China, Japan, and South Korea. And what about the fisheries industry? According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, a truly staggering 11.3 million tons of fish were caught in 2010, about 14.6% of the world's catch. In the same year, 6 Indian Ocean nations, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Thailand, Egypt, and Myanmar, supplied over 11.3 million tons of fish between them, as much as the rest of the regions combined. The Indian Ocean is not only one of the most lucrative maritime trade and fishing routes on the planet, but also home to vast natural resources, the majority of which have yet to be exploited to the full. According to Insight on India, IAS, nodules containing nickel, cobalt, and iron, and gargantuan sulfide deposits of manganese, copper, iron, zinc, silver, and gold are all present in huge quantities on the seabed. But it doesn't end there. The sediments found in the Indian Ocean are important sources of titanium, zirconium, tin, zinc, and copper. To qualify, back in 2017, the Indian Ocean economies accounted for 35.5% of global iron production, 17.8% of world gold production, 16.8% of the world's proven oil reserves, and 27.9% of proven natural gas reserves. That's just a small example of exactly what's at stake here, and why India and China have set themselves on a seeming collision course that could have huge global ramifications. Before we dig even deeper into this most intriguing of geopolitical chess matches, however, we need to give ourselves some demographic context. China and India are two of the biggest nations in the world. China has a population of 1,425,347,415. India, 1,425,775,850. In terms of land mass, China boasts around 9.6 million square meters, about 3.7 million square miles, and India approximately 3.29 million square meters, about 1.2 million square miles. Last year, China's gross domestic product, GDP, was $17.52 trillion. India's GDP for the same period was $3.75 trillion. Militarily, China has over 2 million active servicemen and women and a stockpile of 500 nuclear warheads. India has around 1.2 million active servicemen and women and 164 nuclear weapons, with the present capacity to increase that number to 200 in the near future. We're talking about true global heavyweights in every respect. But how did we get to where we are today? In 5 words, the Belt and Road Initiative. Back in 2012, Wang Jisi of the Institute of International and Strategic Studies at Peking University published a paper that would reshape Beijing's foreign policy objectives. In essence, his paper, Marching West, recommended that China turn away from its powerful allies of the United States in the East, the familiar faces of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, and focus more on Central Asia and the Middle East. When Xi came to power a year later, he initiated a new economic program, later known as the Belt and Road Initiative. Around that time, China had just started to send goods to European markets on trains that followed the 2,000-year-old Silk Road routes across the steppes of Central Asia. When the other nations in Southeast Asia asked to be included, Xi was only too happy to oblige with a maritime Silk Road link between Southeast Asia and South Asia to East Africa. And thus, the Belt and Road Initiative was born. So why would this project lead to so much tension between China and India, especially when you consider the international investment the project attracted? By 2019, Hungary, Portugal, and Italy, a member of the group of 7 leading industrialized democracies, had signed agreements to cooperate. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and countries across Latin America and Africa quickly followed suit. Surely a new lucrative trade route is a good and positive development for all countries concerned. On paper, yes, it is. But as alluded to at the start of the video, there are much bigger prizes at stake here. India's concerns about the Belt and Road Initiative are pressing and manifold. First and foremost, Modi fears that participating in the program would only strengthen China's strategic influence in the region. Naturally, this is something New Delhi wants to avoid at all costs. Granted, improving trade routes with China is all well and good, but India is rightly concerned about its own security and geopolitical interests. India has also expressed concern about the financial implications. The more vociferous critics in New Delhi argue that the Belt and Road Initiative gives China unfair leverage over other countries. If left unchallenged, this could lead to economic and political dependence on China, and eventually result in Beijing expanding its military presence in the Indian Ocean region. But how exactly? Over recent years, China has adopted a dubious and, some would say, mercenary policy whereby Beijing offers financial, infrastructural, or military aid to a lesser nation. However, the repayment terms have an ambiguous dynamic attached to them. In a CNN report from March 2023, China is said to have loaned massive sums to countries across Asia, Europe, and Africa, extending its global influence through mega infrastructure projects and becoming one of the world's biggest creditors in the process. According to Brad Parks, co-author of a joint study from the World Bank, Harvard Kennedy School, Kiel Institute for the World Economy, and the US-based research lab A-Data, Beijing has created a new global system for cross-border rescue lending, but it has done so in an opaque and uncoordinated way. But what are we talking about in terms of figures? China has spent over $240 billion bailing out 22 countries involved in the Belt and Road Infrastructure project, including Argentina, Pakistan, Kenya, and Turkey. An act of global altruism, or a cynical way to exploit countries in their time of need and make them indebted to you in more ways than just the financial. If we adopt the latter mindset, we can construct the following hypothetical situation. Your country is one of those bailed out by Beijing. Naturally, you're hugely grateful, even more so when Xi doesn't come hammering on your door for repayment anytime soon. But what happens if China's leader makes a request to, say, build a military base on your territory, one that might, for instance, make people in New Delhi very nervous indeed? A redefinition of the classic rock and hard place conundrum. And hence, we get to the crux of the matter, two behemoth nations with their eyes on the same massive prizes. But perhaps most tellingly of all, and this is as symbolic as it is of practical geographical concern, the route of the Belt and Road Initiative passes through hotly disputed Kashmiri territory that both India and Pakistan stake historical claims, namely Gilgit-Baltistan. This ethnically diverse Himalayan region was mired in controversy long before Pakistan won its independence from the UK in 1947. Under the partition plan contained in the Indian Independence Act, Kashmir was free to accede to either India or Pakistan. Hari Singh, the Maharaja or local ruler, initially wanted Kashmir to be independent. However, in October 1947, he chose to join India in return for its help against aggression from Pakistani tribespeople. War broke out. India sought the United Nations intercession to decide the dispute, and even though a ceasefire ensued, the situation has remained volatile up until the present day, with a full-blown, if short-lived war breaking out in 1999, with tens of thousands of lives being lost. The eventual creation of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, in 2015 only added fuel to the fire. India felt this was a direct violation of its territorial sovereignty and was the main reason why India refused to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative itself. Fast forward to today and tensions are still running high. In a report in the Hindustan Times from February 2024, former Ambassador Vishnu Prakash claimed that India is decoupling from China and it was no longer business as usual between the two countries. Furthermore, he alleged that there is an unholy alliance between China and Pakistan that will thwart India's initiatives. However, the Belt and Road Initiative is only one part of the puzzle. As we'll shortly explain, both countries have been incredibly active in recent decades. Slowly but surely, they have attempted to gain a strategic stranglehold on the region. If China made one move, India was quick to react with a move of their own. And while China may arguably have the stronger allies, it's India who looks to have put the better military strategy into place to secure their short, medium, and long-term objectives. At the top of the video, we made a pretty bold and wide-reaching claim. India has lured China into a trap. But in every game of cat and mouse, there is constant pursuit, near captures, and repeated escapes. Never more so than when the diamond necklace and string of pearls strategies collided. Confused? Don't worry. Despite the somewhat elaborate imagery conjured by the respective names, these two strategies are easy to understand, especially if you visualize a map with a diamond or pearl adornment draped around the countries involved. Firstly, let's look at China's so-called string of pearls strategy for the Indian Ocean region. According to a report from China Briefing, China is primarily focused on strengthening its ties with Sri Lanka. Why? Simply put, China needs to secure foreign oil and trade routes that are critical to its expansion in the area. How? By establishing an increased level of influence along sea routes through investment, port development, and diplomacy. These investments extend from Hainan Island in the South China Sea through the littorals of the Straits of Malacca. It includes port developments in Chittagong, Bangladesh, Sittwe, Koko, Hyanggi, Kaukpu, Mergui, and Sadek Kyun in Myanmar, Liam Chabang in Thailand, and Sihanoukville in Cambodia. A wide net indeed. To give you a better idea of the scale of the strategy, these routes run across the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Pakistan's Gwadar port, and islands within the Arabian Sea, and into the Persian Gulf. But it hasn't all been plain sailing, far from it, and as the old saying goes, necessity is often the mother of creation. The lack of progress on the Kra Canal project in Thailand, which would directly link the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea, has been cited as a motivating factor in the development of this policy. Ultimately, it will provide a greater presence for China along the sea lines of communication that now anchor the country directly to the Middle East. Naturally, this has proved incredibly disquieting for both India and the United States. They don't know whether this strategy is intended to cement supply lines and trade routes, or whether China is aiming for regional supremacy. But if history teaches us anything, it's best to plan for the worst eventuality. That way you'll be prepared to act if circumstances go against you. India's response? The diamond necklace strategy. What could easily be described as a counter-encirclement strategy against the Chinese expansion we outlined a moment ago. Originally coined by former Foreign Secretary Lalit Mansingh, India has opted for a multi-pronged program, including the building of ports and extensive coastal surveillance radar (CSR) systems to track Chinese warships and submarines. Ultimately, this will solidify defense ties, expand bilateral relations with South Asian countries, island nations in the Indian Ocean region, and Southeast Asian nations, and include regular military exercises with US, Japanese, and Australian naval forces. But what will this achieve exactly? First and foremost, important military and strategic agreements with Vietnam, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand have all been signed, all of which will help India fight back against Chinese expansion in the region. Just as importantly, the strategy will help India access and build ports crucial for its own trade initiatives. But where will these ports likely be located? India is developing the Chabahar port in Iran, opening a new land-sea route to Central Asian countries and bypassing Pakistan. Strategically close to the Chinese Gwadar port, it's also located close to the Strait of Hormuz. This will put India in a great position since it overlooks the Gulf of Oman, a crucially important oil supply route. India is also building deep-sea ports in Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Myanmar with similar strategic objectives. Furthermore, Modi has signed agreements to access naval facilities in Oman and Singapore. This first facility is again close to the Strait of Hormuz, where over 30% of oil exports travel through. The second, on the Changi Naval Base in Singapore, is strategically located close to the Strait of Malacca. And it doesn't stop there. In 2022, India strengthened its historic links to Mongolia and added another diamond to its strategic necklace, an alliance too close for comfort, no doubt, for China. According to India's Economic Times, India has agreed to fund a new greenfield oil refinery project in South Gobi to the tune of $1.2 billion. No small change. India also knows the importance of building solid radar networks. For that reason, they have done deals with Bangladesh, the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. By constructing ports and signing bilateral agreements, India hopes to improve trade ties with the respective nations and open different trade routes, all of which will help India to stymie Chinese influence in these countries and promote India's own economic objectives along the way. Even more worrying from a Chinese perspective, India is also a member of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Quad, an informal alliance of nations comprising the US, Australia, India, and Japan. While not a formal alliance, the Quad represents a strong and real challenge to Chinese hegemony on the global stage. Ostensibly, this group was set up after the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004. Since then, however, one of the group's main objectives, even if not overtly stated, is to curb China's growing influence in the Indian Ocean and both the East and South China Seas. Back in 2022, right after the COVID-19 crisis, Japan hosted a summit to discuss the post-pandemic world. According to a report by the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, the leaders spoke of their resolve to uphold the international rules-based order where countries are free from all forms of military, economic, and political coercion. This broadside was clearly aimed at China's growing use of its economic might to achieve political gains. In that respect, Australia, India, and Japan have all recently felt China's coercive pressures. Speaking of Japan, China's historical adversary, Tokyo signed a trade deal with India back in 2011. The India-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement effectively eliminates tariffs on 90% of Japanese exports to India, including auto parts and electric appliances, and 97% of imports from India, including agricultural and fisheries products. But how does India's membership of these organizations and the signing of these trade deals affect its standing in BRICS? As mentioned at the top of the video, China and India aren't just antagonistic nations locking horns like rutting stags, but members of the same intergovernmental alliance. Founded in 2009 as BRIC, it wasn't until South Africa joined in 2010 that it became BRICS. The basic objective of the alliance was to give emerging economies more influence in international politics. Whether the group has achieved that objective is still up for debate. What can't be denied With the inclusion of more states, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, effectively joined on January 1, 2024, is the collective size and influence of the alliance. Let's give you the facts and figures to back that claim up. The expanded group has a combined population of about 3.5 billion, or 45% of the world's inhabitants. Their economies are worth more than $28.5 trillion, or about 28% of the global economy. Over recent years, however, India has been an increasingly marginalized voice in the BRICS structure. Why? Quite simply, India has become involved with too many strategic partnerships. As a result, Modi has often found himself to be the odd man out when it comes to making many key decisions. In short, you can't be everybody's friend and ally, and it's impossible to keep Washington, Moscow, and Beijing happy when pursuing political, economic, and military agendas diametrically opposed to each of their best interests. So has Modi spread India too thin and in the process watered down the country's influence in key strategic decision-making on a global level? And do the other member states of these organizations now see India as an unreliable ally? The answer? Probably. But high-stakes political maneuvering is nothing if not a tightrope act. After all, the rewards are huge. Let's look at an illustrative example from the Quad Summit mentioned above. Naturally, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the humanitarian crisis in Europe it precipitated were high on the agenda. Tellingly, India found themselves in an incredibly awkward situation again, and for all the wrong reasons. As soon as Putin launched his invasion, all member states, apart from India, imposed brutal sanctions on Russia. But not only that, Modi failed to publicly condemn Putin's actions to the wider international community. Like Pakistan, India abstained from joining a UN resolution. To put that into the appropriate context, only Belarus, Eritrea, North Korea, and Syria openly refused to sign the resolution. Hardly the best company to be keeping in the broader global context. And again, we have to ask the reason why. India is buying oil from Russia at a heavily discounted rate. While a report from Outlook contends that this is a means to secure India's energy security interests and shouldn't therefore be politicized in any way, shape, or form, it doesn't look good to the watching world. And it's something that won't have escaped Beijing's notice. With that in mind, what of India's future in BRICS and the other alliances it has joined in recent decades? For the time being, it looks as if Modi will keep to the status quo if possible, as he sees membership in organizations with such opposing strategic objectives as an unavoidable inconvenience. Whether that will lead to uncomfortable compromises or unavoidable confrontations later down the line remains to be seen. More important for India is its continued expansion and vigilance, as the global stakes couldn't be any higher. Now we are coming to the end of the video, we have a much clearer picture of the current situation and just how India has reacted to China's expansion into the Indian Ocean region. Through the tireless work of its leader, India has responded to each geopolitical roll of the dice with a decisive move of its own. Be it in strategic, militaristic, economic, or political alliances, the diamond necklace looks as if it could put China on a tight leash for many years to come. But what do you think about the state of play at the present time? Has India really drawn China into a trap with its military strategy? Or do you think Beijing has something else up its sleeve? With so much at stake, is an outbreak of hostilities between the two nations now almost inevitable? If so, who would come out on top? Both have powerful allies in the region, and both are huge military powers in their own rights. Will the United States and Russia intercede? We only need to look at the destabilizing international effect of the war in Ukraine to know that another conflict is in no one's best interests. Tell us what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts. In the summer of 2021, China sparked great alarm in Washington when it tested hypersonic missiles. Some in the United States even feared that this test was another Sputnik moment. General Mark Milley, chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, denied that the test was a Sputnik equivalent, but said it was very close to that. How real is this fear? What does the nuclear balance of power between the United States and China look like? If the unthinkable happened, what could a nuclear confrontation between the two look like? Let's begin. China has grown immensely wealthy over the last few decades, especially since it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. And Beijing has used large portions of its enriched coffers in the drive to create a world-class military, capable of competing with the United States. China's naval and air capabilities have increased enormously, but Beijing is now keen to share the love
with its nuclear forces as well. China was one of the recognized powers in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which went into effect in 1970. However, it had always had a limited nuclear capability compared to the true nuclear superpowers of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union. It had few ways of delivering nuclear weapons beyond ICBM launchers and silos, and had a small number of active warheads. That has begun to change at a rapid pace in the last couple of years. In 2020, the United States estimated that China had a little more than 200 nuclear warheads. By the end of 2022, however, China had doubled that number. If Beijing continues its nuclear buildup at this pace, it could have about 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. However, China is not only building up the number of warheads at its disposal, but the means of delivering them. In 2021, China appeared to be building 200 new nuclear missile silos in its Gansu and Xinjiang provinces. However, China understands that these silos are easy targets, so it's also building more road-mobile ICBMs, new ballistic missile submarines, and new bomber-delivered nuclear weapons. In other words, China is trying to create an effective nuclear triad of its own in a bid to protect its nuclear capability and, if need be, enhance its offensive nuclear potential. China completed the triad with its deployment of the nuclear-capable Zhanhong 6 bomber in 2020. Meanwhile, China conducted 135 ballistic missile tests in 2021, more than every other country in the world combined. The biggest buzz, though, went to its hypersonic test that summer. The July 2021 test featured a hypersonic missile that encircled the world before hitting its target. It flew for a total of 40,000 kilometers, the longest flight of any Chinese land attack weapon on record. At this point, it's always important to clear away some of the cobwebs. Hypersonic missiles, projectiles capable of exceeding Mach 5, are not new. Traditional ICBMs have long exceeded these speeds. What would make China's 2021 weapon new is its combination of a fractional orbital bombardment system, FOBS, with a hypersonic glide vehicle, HGV. A FOBS works by flying into low Earth orbit to an altitude of about 240 kilometers. This allows the device to remain below the line of sight of radar systems designed to pick up the arc of traditional ballistic missiles. Then, before completing a full orbit, the FOBS turns around and performs a retrograde engine burn, slowing its speed so that it will intersect with its designated target. The end result is that a FOBS can strike from an unexpected direction. For example, a missile launched to low orbit over Antarctica can turn around and hit Alaska. The Soviet Union experimented with these systems in the 1970s, but work on FOBS was abandoned after the SALT II treaty banned them, and Soviet submarines became more capable of launching ballistic missiles. China is interested in picking up where the Soviet Union left off, however. Beijing partially sees this as a necessity, thanks to greater American investment in missile defense systems following its withdrawal from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. The second component of the system, the HGV, makes the FOBS even more unpredictable. Glide vehicles differ from traditional weapons in how they move toward their targets. Traditional ballistic missiles come at a fast but predictable arc. HGVs ride up to orbit, descend, and glide through the atmosphere to reach their targets. An HGV is able to maneuver, roll, or even pull up on re-entry to re-exit the atmosphere and then enter it again. Through these devices, an HGV can alter its trajectory while maintaining hypersonic velocities, making it fast and hard for missile defense systems to predict. China claimed that this test was of a space plane, not a weapons system, but this was a clever response. It exposes the overlap between space vehicles and these types of weapon systems. The hypersonic missile missed its target by about 24 miles. This is of little comfort if such a weapon were to carry a strategic nuclear warhead, however. The test also raised alarms about an intelligence failure, as US officials realized that China's advancement in hypersonic weapons was further along than they once thought. Potentially, China could send this new weapon on a trajectory over the South Pole. The weapon could then turn around and glide towards American targets, because American missile defense systems are focused on trajectories over the North Pole, which is the route that Soviet ballistic missiles would have taken during the Cold War. The new Chinese weapon would leave the United States particularly vulnerable. China's moves are intended to even the playing field in a dangerous game where it had long lagged behind.
The United States has the world's second largest nuclear arsenal with 5,224 warheads. The United States currently deploys some of its nuclear weapons to 5 other nations: Turkey, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. The forward deployment reduces the risk that America's ability for nuclear retaliation will be wiped out in an enemy-first strike. It also gives the United States greater ability to launch nuclear attacks of its own. American nuclear warheads were once deployed to Japan and South Korea but have since been removed. If nuclear tensions were to escalate with China, it's probable the United States would redeploy those weapons there, something the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe suggested could be a necessity given the current situation in the region, although he only made this suggestion after his premiership had concluded. The United States is regarded as being behind China and Russia in the deployment of hypersonic technology. There have also been major alarms about the state of America's nuclear triad in the last decade. Most of the weapons and delivery systems are many decades old. For example, the land-based part of the nuclear triad consists of about 400 LGM-30G Minuteman III missiles. This weapon system began development in 1964 and entered service in 1970. It's currently the only land-based ICBM in the United States military, and the Air Force plans to use it into the 2030s. Some of the United States land-based ICBM systems are so old that until 2019 they used 1970s-era floppy disks as part of the command and control system. Other parts of the IT system are as old. While this has the advantage of not being vulnerable to cyber warfare, it also means the system is expensive to maintain, as modern engineers are unfamiliar with it, and the Air Force has increasingly needed to rely on costly civilian specialists to maintain the old architecture. The United States maintains a significant lead over China in the realm of submarine warfare. However, its Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines are also old, with their plans originating in the 1970s, and the first vessels being launched in the early 1980s. Meanwhile, the United States has only 20 active bombers capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Its fleet of B-1 and B-52 bombers were once capable of doing this, but were altered to be conventional only in the 1990s. But these weapons platforms are also old anyway. In recent years, the United States has acknowledged that it allowed its nuclear capability to atrophy following the end of the Cold War. During the Obama administration, the United States made plans to modernize the nuclear triad, which took more concrete shape during the Trump administration. It consisted of a $1.2 trillion plan between 2017 and 2046, including $772 billion for the modernization of strategic nuclear delivery systems, $25 billion for tactical nuclear delivery systems, and $445 billion for facilities needed for the operation of the new nuclear triad. One of the primary weapons in this new arsenal will be the Minuteman III's successor, the LGM-35 Sentinel, which the Air Force plans to have ready by 2030. The Sentinel will come with new silos and a new command and control system. The United States is also working on a replacement for the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. This will be the Columbia-class submarine, set to launch in 2031, with 12 of the new vessels planned for construction. So important is this goal that the Navy has identified the Columbia-class submarine as its top priority program, a nod to how vital the US submarine fleet is to deterring China's ambitions. Each Columbia-class submarine will be able to carry up to 16 Trident D5 missiles, each of which can potentially carry 12 Mark IV re-entry vehicles. Although the United States has phased out these multiple re-entry vehicles on its nuclear ballistic missile since 2014, to comply with the New START treaty with Russia, the missiles can be re-equipped with them if the need arises. China is not a member of the New START treaty. Finally, there is the coming B-21 Raider bomber, which is set to replace both the B-1 Lancer and the B-2 Spirit. The Raider was rolled out to photographers for the first time in December 22 and is scheduled to enter service in 2027, with a maiden flight expected in the remaining months of 2023. The Air Force plans to purchase up to 145 B-21s, depending on the plane's engineering and manufacturing development. As the successor of the B-2, the B-21 will be capable of delivering nuclear weapons like the B-61 and B-83 bombs. The United States has also been trying its best to catch up in the hypersonic missile race, and may have closed the gap. In October 2022, the United States launched a test of several hypersonic missile components. These included communications and navigations equipment, and a glide vehicle that can withstand the friction generated by moving at hypersonic velocities. The test was designed to validate aspects of the Navy's conventional prompt strike and the Army's long-range hypersonic weapons program. The Pentagon considered the tests a success. For now, these programs are only experiments, and the Pentagon has still not made a formal decision to acquire hypersonic weapons, according to the Congressional Research Service. Still, the Defense Department spent $4.7 billion on hypersonic weapons research in fiscal year 2023, up from $3.8 billion in fiscal year 2022. Adding these weapons to the United States' traditional nuclear arsenal seems inevitable. How might nuclear war break out? China officially has a no-first-use policy when it comes to nuclear weapons, even if its nuclear forces are attacked by conventional enemy forces. Only in the case of a nuclear weapons strike, officially, would China use its own nukes to retaliate. This policy started with its first nuclear test in 1964, when China declared it will never at any time or under any circumstances be the first to use nuclear weapons. This policy was reaffirmed in a classified Chinese document for the operators of China's nuclear forces, where it put repeat reminders about its no-first-use policy. However, there is skepticism in Washington. The document, called The Science of Second Artillery Operations, has a section concerning what Chinese nuclear forces should do if a strong military power possessing nuclear-armed missiles and an absolute advantage in high-tech conventional weapons is carrying out intense and continuous attacks against our major strategic targets, and we have no good military strategy to resist the enemy. This strong military power is clearly the United States. The document suggests that Chinese nuclear forces should lower the threshold in this scenario and put its nuclear weapons on alert. This is an important distinction, because unlike the United States, China's policy has been to keep its nuclear forces off alert. Its warheads are not mated to its ICBMs, and its nuclear-armed submarines are not on continuous patrol at sea. This suggests that China takes its no-first-use policy seriously. By putting its nuclear forces on alert, China would hope to deter the United States from taking further military action and to not use its nuclear weapons in a potential